Everything begins on a hot summer day. Inside that bus cabin, the heat was so intense it felt like a sauna. Suddenly, people noticed a strange shift in the train's path, and something abruptly appeared before everyone's eyes, making them wonder if it was some kind of movie shoot. Since that thing looked extremely real, even if it stood out too much inside the train, what appeared inside was nothing less than a goblin. And on that day, which was supposed to be ordinary, the protagonists suddenly witnessed true hell on earth. That was when several of those creatures emerged inside, ready to kill, and to take the lives of everyone present on the bus. People began to be killed one after another without hesitation, even those who tried to grab their phones to call the police. Those who tried to call for help ended up being killed instantly, all due to a fast and merciless strike that didn't even let them see what was happening. The screams of the people made those who were still waiting for their end even more anxious. The protagonist himself didn't feel like he could calm down from the fear of death anytime soon. Everyone on that bus was going to die in just a few minutes, and that place had turned into nothing but a slaughterhouse. Regardless of being men or women, adults or children, they were all targets. And so more than 80% of Seoul's population was destined to die. Obviously, the protagonist himself wondered if he could survive such a situation. But unfortunately, he was just a player without any talent in that world. He was doomed to struggle harder than anyone else just to meet his end. In Jongno-gu, Seoul, in the year 2028, people were still living their ordinary, everyday lives. Two of them were chatting about the exams they had recently taken and laughing because they did so poorly. They worried that if they failed this time, they would have to repeat the year, and so they would lose their chance to move on to the next class. Among those ordinary people was our protagonist, named Kim Kepchin. He was a 30-year-old man studying for the next exam to become a civil commander, and had already wasted 7 years of his life retaking that same exam over and over. He was an ordinary person without any talent to become a true player. 10 years ago, after the portal opened in Seoul, unbelievable disasters began spreading throughout the city. But at the same time, a number of survivors awakened. They became something that ended up being called players, even though he once dreamed of becoming a player too. The boy gave up on that dream long ago, after realizing he had no talent for that kind of life. Now he simply spent his time focusing his mind on passing the civil service exam. During his lunch break, he overheard a conversation between two people. They mentioned a video about someone named Wak Taeyeon. He was a player they were impressed by for being able to fight so well. People found him incredible, and that was one of the reasons they called him God Taeyeon. Some even envied his abilities, commenting that even they could do just as much for the world if they had just 1% of his skill. Meanwhile, normal people like them could only work hard and push themselves, as civil servants trying to make a living with their own hands. Then, out of nowhere, they began talking about how Hyukjin was once an impressive player, that in the past he took the aptitude test for players, and only managed to score the worst grade, finishing in last place. He became known as the Dead Genius. It was a pity, because he discovered his talents too late to be properly acknowledged, which was truly a shame. They said that apparently additional tests had been done, and that's how they found out he had several sealed talents. They had to go through a lot of effort to unlock all of them, across multiple tests, practically giving him the chance to recover lost time. But it was all for nothing, which was quite ironic, because normally the opportunity to become a great player and discover your talent comes around your early 20s, but the protagonist was different. Hyukjin was never able to unlock it the right way. He had just dragged his awakening all the way into his 30s. It was loud and clear that Hyukjin was just another person with no future in life. But the protagonist thinks he already knew that. He always knew he should never have hoped to become a true player one day. He remembers how things were 7 years ago. Thinking of his last chance to become a player, he took the aptitude test and ended up getting the results, only to discover that he had just one aptitude among the many that existed, and he had no real talent to be a player. The talent aptitude test was a government exam looking for great talent, one that might be hidden within people and would make them true players. Taking the test would show how many active and inactive talents one had. In the end, the number of active talents he had was just one. That was a bad enough result to be considered unwanted. He would have preferred to have no talent at all from the start, but back then he didn't know anything. He never would have imagined that the head of the Players Association would personally show up just to deliver his results. That's because Hyukjin had only graduated from an ordinary school, and there was nothing particularly impressive about his resume. At the very least, he had hoped to become a civil hunter's assistant, but he just kept on failing over and over again. The life of a talented player and that of an ordinary person were as different as heaven and hell. The difference in treatment between those two types of people was always clear. Renowned players were interviewed and received more attention than they could have ever imagined, all because they managed to find interesting items inside the dungeons they explored. They always acted with complete confidence due to the favorable treatment they received. Meanwhile, those who were ordinary people, or had little to no talent like Hyukjin, weren't even seen as people worthy of any real attention. That was the main reason why the disappointment of not becoming a player was nothing but a grand luxury, one that Hyukjin could never even dare to imagine. So he simply decided to go back home and study more, hoping to eventually pass one of the regular civil service exams. He wasn't even excited about the days ahead anymore, given how complicated and hopeless his days had become after the cataclysm that happened on April 27, 2018. There were countless horrible events that developed since that time. It always started with the primordial mist in Seoul, which caused the death of 145,000 out of the 150,000 participants. In the end, it was only fair to say that Jongno-gu was nearly completely wiped out. It was so terrifying that even the reporters covering the event couldn't react properly. Fiction also remembers another player called Sang-yeon, someone very influential since the Cataclysm 10 years ago, and now a renowned player in that world to the point of giving regular interviews. In this interview, Sang-yeon claims that after so much time in the field, he had enough experience. He could say with full confidence that effort was always more important than talent, and he asked everyone to keep their eyes on him during that time, because he intended to keep growing stronger and stronger. Kukshin wonders if effort alone could really take someone to that level, and whether his own efforts simply hadn't been enough to get him there. The protagonist sighs and thinks he shouldn't be dwelling on pointless things. Surely there was no reason to focus his thoughts on the impossible now. Hyukshin thinks that if he had even a bit of talent, he might have awakened as a real player. Maybe he would have been chosen by a guardian, able to make his own fortune. Hyukshin is surprised that even now, after so many years, he still had a bit of hope. But in the end, it was all his fault that things ended up in such a chaotic way. The fact that his mother died from her own illness. How his sister ended up working at a semiconductor factory so they could escape poverty. She went on to develop leukemia, and so many other things were also his fault. Hyukshin thinks that even if he could succeed for the sake of his family, he was still someone without talent, money, or anything truly valuable. He failed the civil service exams multiple times. They never found out why or exactly what he was doing so wrong. After ending up receiving attention just for being so utterly incompetent, he wonders when exactly things began to go wrong in his life. Hyukshin always believed he gave his all to achieve his goals, but in the end, that certainly wasn't the case. He asked himself if anything might have changed had he tried harder to reach his goals. But if things continued as they were now for the rest of his life, he didn't even know exactly what he should do anymore. Hyukshin ended up feeling quite lonely after thinking about all of that. With those thoughts in mind, he lay down on his bed to sleep that night. The next morning, Hyukshin woke up without knowing what time it was, and then he remembered that today was the day of the midterm evaluation. Even though he had gone to bed early, he still managed to wake up late. The protagonist decided to take a shower before leaving and wondered what time the evaluation would happen. Then he decided to head out to take his exam as usual. But on his way there, he realized that something felt off that day. Something wasn't right, though he couldn't tell exactly what it was. At the station, the bus finally arrived and Hyukshin continued to feel that discomfort. Something seemed completely out of the ordinary that day, even if he didn't know the reason why. He got on the bus, still thinking that he was probably just overthinking it, and figured he should just focus on reviewing his notes for the evaluation during the ride. Hyukshin then began studying for the exam. Just like it happened 10 years ago in Jongno-gu, that was the beginning of the Cataclysm. He listened to people around him chatting about random topics like the weather and popular idols. While reviewing information about the killer fog, a sudden change occurred. People inside the bus noticed that a large amount of fog had appeared and was spreading rapidly. They wondered what was going on because it was so thick they couldn't even see outside. There hadn't been any news warning of sudden weather changes. On top of that, a strange and horrible smell began to spread through the air. Hyukshin noticed that he had received an emergency SMS about a major disaster about to occur. It reported that a deep fog had appeared that day in Jongno-gu, April 27, 2018. Everyone was being advised to drive carefully and safely while the chaos lasted. Then the protagonist finally realized what was wrong. He had actually awakened in the past. He had gone back in time by 10 years. His instinctive unease was just because he had already lived through that day before. The events of the day of the Cataclysm were unfolding in exactly the same way as a decade ago. That made him realize that all of Jongno-gu, including Wang women, was in danger. They would be completely engulfed by the powerful fog and the horrors that came with it. If that was real, then the bus he had taken heading to Jongno-gu, there was a chance he might die. Since nearly 100% of the people who were in Jongno-gu had, Hyukshin realized that he had gone back to the past. But not only that, he knew what was going to happen during that time. How everything would unfold until it reached the present he once knew. Suddenly, a kind of game system window appeared in front of his eyes, telling players to prepare, which confused Hyukshin. The screen announced that the tutorial was about to begin. 10 years ago, that same tutorial had occurred, when monsters appeared from inside the dungeons that opened across the world. Countless monsters began pouring out from them, slaughtering humans without giving them a chance to fight back. During the week of the Cataclysm, later also called the beta or tutorial, nearly 150,000 people died in Jongno, where the survival rate was only around 3%. It became known as the worst day in the history of mankind. But after that incident, the beings known as players emerged in the world. They quickly subdued the monsters. The catastrophic dungeons in Jongno were slowly cleared by their hands. Invasions from different dungeons were marked by major battles between players throughout history. Recordings were made in order to be used for the creation of virtual dungeons. And so the world began to slowly reorganize itself after the Great Disaster. The protagonist had memorized each of those dungeon recordings at the time and watched them all. He completed those virtual dungeons hundreds of times, driven by his fascination and desire to become a player. In fact, it would be hard to find anyone who knew more about those incidents than him, even if he was never able to become a real player. He memorized every one of those useless dungeon raids and played through them countless times. And it was in those moments that Hyukjin showed his potential and became the best player in the world, even if it was only inside the virtual world. Back in the present, the tutorial was about to begin. The system window warned all players to prepare themselves. Hyukjin knew those notifications would appear during the cataclysm. He had only ever heard about them in theory, but seeing them live was far different from what he expected. Suddenly, the bus crashed into something and all the passengers were shaken. After all, they couldn't even see what was outside the bus, and they began to worry that something serious might be happening. Hyukjin tried to stay calm. Those were events that had been foretold and had already happened in the past. But the protagonist realizes that the others on the bus hadn't heard the tutorial notification, which should mean he was the only player there. He could only survive by using everything he knew, and by carefully analyzing the situation before making any rash decisions. The system tells them to pay close attention to their actions, because the nameless observer was starting to take an interest in them. Hyukjin thinks that he was probably what used to be known as a kind of guardian. The nameless observer was now looking to grant him a beta opening bonus. That was supposed to happen only to famous and important rankers, so it confuses the protagonist. Guardians were known as those who watched from above the players. A player's fate was determined by the bonuses and favors granted by a guardian. Guardians were beings from a dimension above the players. That was why they always used nicknames when contacting players rather than their real names. The system announces that through the beta opening bonus, he would be granted the serene eye of the observer. Hyukjin thinks it's strange as he suddenly feels calmer after receiving the bonus, almost as if he's being watched from somewhere in a third-person perspective. It makes him feel impartial to the situation. The system informs that the tutorial would begin a quest in 10 seconds, and the countdown starts. The driver tells the passengers that the fog is too thick. He won't be able to keep driving and they'll need to reach their destination another way. The protagonist is surprised because the chaos seems to be starting much faster than expected. The passengers complain that it's a horrible morning, and that they're all going to be late for their morning tasks, realizing they should just get off the bus and run to wherever they needed to go. But Hyukjin shouts for them not to leave because that was the only way they could survive. The system notifies again that the nameless observer is showing interest in him, but everyone stays focused on the street as a great light suddenly appears. It's nothing less than a portal opening from which a being emerges. The system names it an intermediate administrator. The administrator, named Sinya, greets everyone nearby and introduces herself, explaining that they were now all inside her tutorial. The tutorial quest instructs the players to survive in the field for 7 days. They would not be able to leave that space. The next difficulty would be decided based on the number of survivors. As the system explains all this to them, the ordinary people are completely confused and ask Sinya what's happening. If it's some kind of movie recording and they demand an explanation, Sinya responds that they must gain their own strength to survive during the tutorial quest. Soon everyone is shocked as a corpse suddenly appears in front of the bus, shocking them all with a large amount of blood splattered on the window. Hyukjin knew that spreading fear through deaths among civilians was part of their strategy. The system warns that screams and external movements have been detected, with goblin troops beginning to emerge from this new world. The first goblin attacked and the troops followed to invade Jeonnam district. The passengers are horrified as they see shadows starting to approach the bus. All were strange silhouettes that began to gather and climb over them. The passengers realize they need to escape and get out, but the protagonist yells for them not to open the door because it would only make things worse. Hyukjin knew the goblins would start a massacre outside. They had to stay inside to remain safe, but seeing how everyone was acting, he didn't think their chances of survival would improve much. 10 years after the raids began, humanity had developed strategies. The best way to survive a goblin attack was to face them in a certain death sentence. Even knowing how to face them, applying that knowledge in practice was another matter. Hyukjin knew he couldn't face those creatures in the tutorial with his current strength. Goblins were physically far stronger than humans, which meant they would soon break into the bus and cross it to attack them. The passengers scream in shock when the door breaks and they panic trying to run. But Hyukjin tells everyone to crouch down and stay put. He knows it would be hard for them to obey, considering they're all scared and confused by what's going on. But Hyukjin insists they listen to him if they want to survive because there's no more time. No one knew exactly what he was talking about. They just wanted to know if they were supposed to stay inside with everything happening outside. Obviously, they should find a way to escape as quickly as possible. Hyukjin knew it was already too late to consider something like that now. The system emphasized that the nameless observer was watching his actions with great interest, allowing the status window to activate as well as the inventory. The protagonist was surprised to see the status window and realized that all of his points were ridiculously high, considering that even the best players at the beginning only had 9 points, while he now had 11 points right in the tutorial. The passengers screamed again as the goblins began smashing the windows to get inside. Soon, one of them was pierced by a goblin's weapon while still crying out for help. A chaotic scene began inside the bus, and Hyuchin lay down on the floor, blending in with the bodies, using the beta bonus to keep calm, which was working perfectly. The protagonist knew there were some survival conditions within the safe zone during the tutorial. One of them was inside the bus, and to meet the safety conditions, for the sake of survival, he needed to stay calm. Hyuchin was worried that any movement could bring his survival plan to an end. But somehow, he still managed to stay calm enough that the goblin didn't notice him. He thought it was all thanks to the bonus he had received from the Guardian. Even though he didn't know why he'd gotten the bonus, he was able to use it to survive. Hyuchin thought that if his knowledge about the future was correct, then the first wave of attacks would continue for a long 10 minutes. It would take only a few more minutes for them to finish the wave. He just needed to survive a little longer during that short period of time. It was hard even for Hyuchin to remain completely calm when the goblins touched him. He tried to stay as still as possible so he could make the most of every second. The system notified that the brave Lion King had given Hyuchin a chance, which surprised the protagonist because it was a different Guardian who decided to help him. That Guardian chose to give him something called a high-potency elixir. The Guardian gave it eagerly, wanting to see how far Hyuchin's courage could still go. That elixir was a gift that could be used for 10 minutes, temporarily increasing his strength by 6 points. Hyuchin realized that he had received multiple things even during the tutorial. When a player increased their skills and leveled up, they would get a status boost. Taking that elixir would be the equivalent of boosting his physical strength by 3 levels. Knowing this, Hyuchin thought he could fight the goblins now, having enough power to beat them using that elixir. Hyuchin knew that the Guardian who gave him the elixir probably wanted to see him fight. Putting his courage on the line, he mentally complained, because those Guardians were being arrogant for expecting him to simply agree to their request. Hyuchin knew there were only a few seconds left before the raid ended. He could survive without doing anything too risky at that point. The brave Lion King wanted to begin a negotiation with the intermediate administrator, and so Sinya stated that according to the Guardian's requests, the tutorial field would be altered. Hyuchin realized the Guardian was trying any means necessary to make him fight. Among the many Guardians, the brave Lion King was especially infamous. He was a Guardian fascinated by reckless courage, the spirit of challenge, and the useless passion of players. Unfortunately, that Guardian was also twisted. He always enjoyed watching players suffer with expressions of pain, as they faced adversity while throwing themselves into foolish bravado, and he found it entertaining. The protagonist knew what the brave Lion King wanted was the complete removal of the safe zone. Sinya stated that the negotiation with the Guardian had been completed. According to the request, the conditional safe zone would be abolished in 30 seconds. Hyuchin then pointed out that if a tutor forcibly alters the scenario, there should be a corresponding reward given to the player affected by it. They were trying to force him to stay quiet and be satisfied with just his strength-boosting elixir. He said Sinya couldn't overlook the rules, especially if his life was at stake, that it wasn't right to ignore the commandments, which surprised the administrator. The nameless observer was equally impressed, but the brave Lion King fell silent. Sinya asked about the commandments he mentioned. The protagonist said it was an irrational complaint just like that, thinking it was normal for them to be surprised. After all, the laws and commandments weren't even discovered until 7 years after the tutorial. Sinya asked how Hyuchin knew about the commandments, and he dodged the question, saying it wasn't important. After all, there was no need for a player to explain to anyone how to play the game, which silenced her. The protagonist also says that they've already spent 10 seconds talking, which means 10 seconds of his time in the safe zone were gone. She would need to find a way to make up for the time they lost there. Sinya agrees that Hyuchin is right. In accordance with the commandments, she extends the safe zone time by another 10 seconds. In addition, she will compensate him with something related to the change in scenario. Hyuchin receives a quality lubricant. It was an item that could be used to enhance the sharpness of blades, or used in other applications as well. He also receives a rusty steel sword that couldn't cause much lethality, but it had an attack power ranging between 2 and 5 points. The protagonist realizes he couldn't complain anymore. At least he's satisfied because he managed to get something. All because he mentioned the commandments. When he returns, the goblin invasion wave is over and everyone exits the bus. Thanks to that conversation, he had an easy time using the safe zone condition, and was able to survive without having to fight the monsters. The system alerts that the brave Lion King is disappointed, but the protagonist couldn't care less. He ends up seeing the bodies of all the passengers on the ground and almost vomits. Trying to stay strong and calm himself, he needed to focus on continuing to survive. Hyuchin knows that the tutorial week is a living hell, but if he wanted to survive through that period, he would need to go out in search of water and food. So the protagonist leaves the bus, heading to the nearest convenience store about 300 meters away as his top priority. Hyuchin was aware of it because he had studied that area for 3 years, so he knew the space very well. But given the short amount of time, he had to move quickly, or he'd end up caught defenseless. Meanwhile, a man screams for help because there were injured people nearby. He needed assistance, and although Hyuchin was aware of them, he couldn't tell exactly where they were. Considering the fog still obscured most of his vision, Hyukjin decides to use the bus he had been in as a reference point. Even then, it was hard to tell where he needed to go, especially while trying to avoid detours. He wonders if it's because he's still under the Guardian's bonus that he can remain this calm, even with all the destruction and dead bodies scattered everywhere, until suddenly he gets startled by an arm under the car. He almost thinks it's just another corpse, until he hears a voice asking for help. Hyukjin notices a survivor and approaches to get a closer look. On the other side of the car, there's a goblin also lying underneath. Apparently, some kind of mistake happened. Despite the raid retreat order when it ended, for some reason this one ended up stuck there. The goblin was laughing and preparing to take the life of the woman who was trapped. She begs Hyukjin to save her. She doesn't want to die yet because she still wants to see her mother. Hyukjin realizes it's a child begging for her life. At first, it was hard for him to notice that, because he had been startled by the presence of a survivor. But in reality, she wasn't injured when the goblin tried to cut her legs. That's probably because the child had received some kind of bonus, just like Hyukjin during the tutorial. Instead of screaming in pain from what the goblin was doing, she was screaming out of fear. In the end, the goblin was too focused on trying to kill her to notice anything else. The protagonist wonders if this was what people normally called a player's talent. Suddenly, the administrator approaches and says that it was actually a baby goblin. Even so, it should be difficult for a level 1 to defeat it so easily. Hyukjin realizes that if Sinya was telling the truth, then it was even more impressive. After all, that child hadn't even processed what was happening due to her extreme panic. But in truth, she had an impressive tanker-type ability. Not even the first king, so Yu Yan, would have had such capacity under those circumstances. Hyukjin thinks that if he left things as they were, more goblins might show up, and she would end up losing her life, so he decides to act quickly. The protagonist opens his inventory to draw his sword. Even though he had knowledge about the fields, applying that knowledge was very different from the virtual world. With that, he decides to summon his rusty iron sword. Even though the administrator said that was a baby goblin, things could still turn out differently if he fought the monster one-on-one. If Hyukjin could use that to his advantage, he'd strike the goblin's weak spot while it was still distracted. Even more so when there was one who wasn't even fighting back. With that in mind, the protagonist decided to approach and strike the monster from behind, and successfully hit it, receiving the corresponding experience for defeating the monster. Thus, Hyukjin managed to finish the task in just a single blow, and finally told the child to get up from where she was. She should grab her things or he'd just leave her behind if she didn't follow him. She decided to stand up and do as he said, following him through the streets. The two of them arrived at a shop and Hyukjin warned her not to open those doors no matter what. That left her a bit confused, but she didn't respond. He insisted on knowing whether she understood or not due to her silence, and she nodded. Hyukjin wondered if she was gripped by fear. It was quite common given the situation. It would be strange if that hadn't happened from the very beginning. But despite understanding her hesitation, he knew there were other things that needed to be done. The system warned that the 200 waves of goblin attacks would begin soon, thus initiating the establishment of safe zones for the players. Hyukjin asked if the girl could also see the system, and she agreed. The safe zones were places like schools, convenience stores, and hospitals. The protagonist concluded that, just as he had predicted, she was a player with great potential. Usually, you could only confirm convenience stores as safe zones during the second wave of attacks. But players with talent like hers could also see that hospitals were safe zones, which proved her great potential as a player. Still, it was confusing for Hyukjin himself, because he was able to see the hospital safe zones too, even though he wasn't a player with great talent. And that notification was even more intriguing. It warned that there were extra safe zones. Setting aside his confusion, Hyukjin decided to focus on their safety first. That was when the system announced the start of the second wave of goblin attacks. He then told her she really shouldn't open the door. If she wasn't confident enough to do anything, she should just sit and stay away from the door. With the safe zones now fully established by the system, a primordial fog began to surround the area. Right as the goblins started to prowl outside, people still tried to fight the monsters with some weapons, but they all ended up being cruelly killed by each one of them. Others spotted nearby convenience stores and ran toward them. They begged for help, asking for the doors to be opened. Otherwise, they would all lose their lives in that newly formed chaos. Hyukjin remained still even when everyone cursed at him for not opening the door. He thought he hadn't felt anything at first. Watching it all unfold before his eyes was agonizing, especially when the goblins appeared outside and struck down the people who were begging for help. It was impossible to force your way into a safe zone. Unfortunately, the moment the door was opened from inside the safe zone, it would disappear immediately. Hyukjin and the girl could also be at risk of dying in there if they had tried to help others. He would record all of that in his memory, including the forgotten system that God had set in motion, and the guardians who were watching the slaughter as if it were all just one big game. He intended to return the favor for all the losses and suffering caused. 6 hours later, after the second wave, things seemed a bit safer. The girl thanked Hyukjin because she knew she wouldn't have been able to do anything, and hadn't even had the chance to greet him earlier, introducing herself as Kang Sunhwa. Sunhwa said she was happy to have met Hyukjin. He interrupted her, saying he hadn't really done anything worth helping, so she shouldn't think of thanking him now, only once everything was over. Hyukjin said he might end up using her as bait if necessary, which made Sunhwa desperate not to be discarded like that. She asked if she had done something wrong for him to decide such a thing. The protagonist hadn't meant to say it that coldly on purpose. Hyukjin explained that he only meant he couldn't guarantee her safety until the end of the tutorial. It was hard enough just keeping himself safe alone. As long as his own life was still secure enough, he didn't intend to discard her. Then he told her that she could rest for now, because they would find a way out by the next morning. Manhwa asked where they would be going the next day. Hyukjin looked at the system window where it showed the safe zones, and it also revealed the extra safe zones, one of which was on the second floor of the parking garage in the park tower. He replies that they are heading to Gwangwoman, thinking that the girl probably still couldn't see the extra safe zones. Even he had never heard of them before, but he still knew one thing. That was because the Gwangwoman Tower was the key to turning things around in that tutorial. The next morning, they leave the convenience store. Hyukjin asks if Manhwa is okay after seeing the corpses, and she agrees. But the protagonist feels that there's no way she's truly fine. After all, it was too brutal a sight for a girl like her. She was probably just pretending to look tough. Still, he's surprised because walking through a destroyed city is quite a scenario. There were bodies everywhere, and they hadn't even come across a single survivor. Hyukjin tells Manhwa to stay alert and notify him if she sees anything like jelly sliding on the ground, which leaves the girl quite confused about what he's trying to say. Soon, they end up seeing exactly the creature he was talking about. It was none other than a slime. Hyukjin is surprised because he didn't expect to encounter one so quickly. They were neutral monsters that didn't display their level properly, being creatures much safer to deal with. Even small children had the chance to defeat them without much trouble. Hyukjin kills the slime with his sword and receives experience as well as 3 coins, which surprises him because although it was his first time using a sword, it still gave him a nostalgic feeling for some unknown reason. Manhwa is surprised because the slime disappeared after being struck, and he explains that those were the weakest monsters, but they would keep showing up along the way, so they should always stop to kill them whenever possible. That's why she should stay alert whenever she sees one on the ground. Manhwa agrees and says she'll help spot them. But Hyukjin finds it strange because everything felt too easy. He had only ever used swords inside virtual dungeons. Even so, using them in real life should have felt different. He felt as if he had always been a swordsman since the beginning of time. He felt familiar with that sword. Manhwa keeps helping the protagonist find slimes and he keeps killing them. The one he had just defeated was now the 5th of those monsters. Hyukjin is surprised because for some reason, Manhwa was really good at spotting the monsters. As he keeps killing the slimes, eventually Hyukjin reaches level 2 and receives 2 bonus stat points and 1 random point. Manhwa is shocked and asks what happened for his body to shine like that. Hyukjin replies that he leveled up, explaining that every time they kill monsters, they get stronger. Manhwa said she'll do her best to level up too. But in truth, this was Hyukjin's first time leveling up as well. Even so, for some reason, he always felt a sense of familiarity when using his sword. In the end, he keeps killing monsters and reaches level 3, earning 2 more bonus points and another random one. The protagonist feels like he's leveling up quickly, and the random bonus stat points are intriguing. It was the second time he had received them. That's because the first king, Suyuhyun, was known as the tutorial finisher. According to the writings left behind, random stat bonuses had always existed, but even he took a long time to find them. Still, Hyukjin had already received 2 of those bonus points. He remembers how, in the past, he had always failed the aptitude tests for having no talent at all, which makes him wonder if his talent had improved for some reason upon returning to the past. Although he's not sure if he really had no talent during that whole time. If he hadn't gotten stronger, then he was certain it must have been the result of a player awakening. That only revealed its skill growth at the start. It was just a possibility. All of it turned out to be very beneficial to him, as he survived and reached level 3. Thanks to that, he also gained some interest points from the Guardians who were watching. If Hyukjin really was a player who had an early awakening, then there was a chance he could reach his great goal after surviving the tutorial. In 3 years, a disease-curing potion would be released on the market. It would cost around 1 billion, and if he could get that money by then, he could use the potion to heal his mother so he had to survive for now, and save up all that money over a long period of time. During their journey to the Gwangwoman Tower, Manhwa and Hyukjin kept killing slimes. He managed to reach level 5, always receiving 2 bonus points and 1 random one, which kept surprising him whenever he looked at the bonus stat screen again. That was when he ended up unlocking something even more important in the system that caught his attention. It was called Party, and upon reaching level 5, he used it to invite Manhwa into his group. She officially became a member of his team, and from then on they could share even more things. By being on the same team, they could share the experience they earned. Manhwa was surprised to see the new features presented by the system. The nameless guardian was observing Hyukjin with interest, but the protagonist ignored him as Manhwa thanked him, saying she would try hard to work and be useful to him, asking him not to abandon her. Hyukjin felt she must be very afraid of being abandoned again. Even though he still felt sorry for her, he was also struggling to survive in that world, and responded that he understood her determination, so long as she proved it with actions and not just words. Despite leveling up quickly and getting all the random bonus stats, there was still that guy waiting for them on the first floor of the Gwangwoman Tower. Hyukshin thought maybe he wouldn't be able to protect Sunwoo when they fought him. It was pretty ridiculous to think someone at level 5 could protect anyone nearby. Suddenly, someone mentioned something and pointed to a creature ahead, asking if it was a new type of monster. The system showed that it was a level 3 city fox, and Hyukshin remembered it was also a neutral monster. But it was a passive monster that grouped with others of its kind to retaliate against attackers. They would need to move around the monster quietly. That was when Sunwoo realized she could use a skill called Taunt, not knowing that it would attract the attention of several foxes onto her. Hyukshin tried to help her and noticed that despite everything, Sunwoo wasn't taking much damage. The foxes were still gathering quickly, trying to kill him. So he had to aim for their necks and take them down. Hyukshin defeated several of those city foxes, and when he finished, he asked if she was hurt anywhere. Meanwhile, the system alerted that he had leveled up several more times, reaching level 8. Just then, the administrator approached and asked what level he was. Hyukshin thought it was curious that Senya was interested in that and answered that he was level 8. Senya doubted his words, to which the protagonist suggested she just scan him to find out. The administrator realized he wasn't lying. At that moment, the nameless guardian was surprised by how fast he was getting stronger. Several other anonymous guardians were now impressed by Hyukshin. The protagonist knew that his leveling speed should draw attention. Even he found it strange and decided to open the status window. Normally, the distributed points of a level 8 player shouldn't be that high. It was clear that his growth was unusual, but also a good opportunity to use to his advantage. So Hyukshin said they would be heading inside the tower where a dungeon was available. That's why he would give Sunwoo instructions once they were inside on what to do. If she didn't follow the plan, she would certainly die. Sunwoo was surprised by his words, but the protagonist explained that she didn't need to worry or be scared as long as she did what he said. Hyukshin killed a few more of those city foxes alongside Sunwoo, also receiving an item called Worn Iron Gauntlets. He immediately handed the item to Sunwoo. The preparations for them to climb the dungeon tower were complete. All that was left was to follow the plan, so Hyukshin explained they should enter the tower right now. As they approached the tower, the system announced that entry into that dungeon required being at least level 5. When they reached the entrance, she asked if they really wanted to go into the dungeon. Hyukshin replied yes before the two of them entered together. They quickly spotted several monsters inside that immediately noticed their presence. Hyukshin asked if Sunwoo remembered well what she was supposed to do, and she nodded. The protagonist disbanded the party with Sunwoo and told her to start with the goblins. The two split up so they could kill the monsters inside the dungeon. He thought that unlike a high-level dungeon where all monsters were hostile toward invaders all the time, that D-rank tower had hostile goblins and neutral city wolves. So if they hunted only the goblins first, the city wolves wouldn't attack. In the process, the protagonist was impressed by Sunwoo. She looked like a genius player for handling the creatures with great skill and fighting very well. The goblins' attacks didn't even reach her. She was a much better player than he expected. When some were finished, Hyukshin praised her for doing a good job, and he asked her to take a quick break now to rest. Meanwhile, he thinks that the mini-bosses would probably appear soon. They usually wouldn't show up as long as the nearby monsters were still alive. Hyukshin says that if someone had caught her breath, they would move on to hunt the remaining monsters. She agrees with him before starting to take care of the foxes from the neutral city. There were only a few monsters left to be killed. Suddenly, the system announces that the pause has gone into effect. The nameless observer was expressing intense curiosity about Hyukshin, as was the brave Lion King along with the unnamed guardians who seemed to stir in anticipation. Someone starts speaking to Hyukshin, and he realizes that a pause had been triggered in that world, and he wonders if that was the great power capable of temporarily freezing everything in the field. It was a skill the administrator could use. Senya approaches, asking if he had gone insane, even though she had used one of those expensive items just to stop time. Hyukshin says he doesn't understand what she's talking about. Senya explains that up until now he's been acting like he knew everything that was going to happen, and asks if this was something he had planned too. When the protagonist replies that it might be or might not, the administrator questions why he would do something so foolish. After all, the mini-boss he was trying to summon on that floor was a level 13 goblin soldier. Since it was a mini-boss, it even received a large stat boost to its abilities when entering the field. He wasn't an opponent a level 8 player like Hyukshin could face, especially while bringing just one person as backup. Senya asks again why he would pick a fight he couldn't possibly win. Hyukshin feels like she didn't want him to die, which confused her. But the protagonist thinks that, as expected, the administrator was trying to lie. It was pretty clear they must have a strong interest in him. Just like Senya mentioned earlier, he was a player acting like he could see a future. In the end, he was a rare element expected to put on a great show for the Guardians. That's why the administrator probably preferred Hyukshin to survive rather than die there. It must be something important since the protagonist had never heard about her in the future. Senya shouldn't have any proper excuse for showing her interest. He even remarks that she must just be clumsy when it comes to excuses. Terrible enough to be an intermediate administrator who was sidelined, especially before the events involving the dungeons became famous. That must have been why no one heard of her later on. Senya asks if Hyukshin is trying to insult her, but the protagonist replies he's just stating the truth. After all, she was simply wasting their time by letting things unfold this way. If she wanted to bring something more exciting for the Guardians to watch, he suggests an idea. After the pause ends, she could explain that he wouldn't defeat the goblin soldier. After that, he would personally take care of a monster, even if she denied the possibility. Sydney asks if they seriously intended to hunt the goblin soldier. Hyukjin tells her to think it through more carefully. How could a level 8 player defeat a mini-boss? Of course, saying that out loud would only drive the Guardians crazy. After reflecting on that, Sydney could become a capable intermediate administrator, who could give the Guardians a good show to watch. In exchange for the hints he was offering to help stir her audience's interest, Hyukjin wanted her to make a deal with him. The administrator felt that his recklessness knew no bounds, and she summons her powers because her patience is running thin. But Hyukjin points out that if she really intended to kill him, she would have done it long ago. He asks if it wouldn't be a waste to throw him away after giving him that pause. After all, she'd lose nothing by making a deal with him now. She asks what kind of deal he had in mind. Meanwhile, Manhwa keeps killing monsters and levels up. The girl turns and informs the protagonist that she's managed to kill all the monsters just as told. Hyukjin tells her to come closer, and the system announces that all monsters have been properly eliminated. The conditions for summoning the mini-boss of that floor, the goblin soldier, had been fulfilled. The goblin mini-boss appears on that floor alongside some other monsters, thus declaring its new battle zone. Hyukjin hides with Manhwa and tells her to lower her head, thinking that seeing that creature in person was absolute madness. The goblins quickly start reacting on their own to the presence of intruders. The protagonist knows that the cleanest way to kill a goblin soldier is to watch and make it waste its most powerful ability. This was a skill called Spear Throw. First, they had to find a way to dodge the attack without getting hit. After the goblin tried to strike them while they were still hiding, Hyukjin said they would begin the killing, and Manhwa followed him to hunt the goblin boss. He told Senya to watch closely how a mere level 8 player could defeat a mini-boss with his own hands. Sensing their presence, the level 13 goblin soldier prepared to hunt the players. The protagonist thought that, just as expected from a mini-boss, this was a predictable reaction. The pressure from that monster was completely different from all the others. After missing that lethal spear throw right at the beginning of the battle, the goblin soldier shifted his attention to attack the survivors, charging at both of them. The goblin would move in different ways, either slashing at them with his blade or wielding another weapon. The goblins tried to strike Hyukjin, but he dodged their attacks and killed the small monsters with his sword before attacking the boss. The slash of his sword wasn't as deep as it should have been. As expected, he couldn't deal heavy damage with his current attack power against a much higher level boss. The boss charged at them again, and the protagonist knew this time it would try a different attack method. Hyukjin was surprised because its movements were truly fast, but despite its speed, he was still able to predict them well enough, all in order to land a counterstrike. He was determined to kill the goblin boss no matter what it took, using everything available to make it possible. Meanwhile, Manhwa used her taunt skill to draw the attention of the smaller goblins. Taking all the damage, she followed Hyukjin's instructions exactly as he had told her, enduring every hit and all the pain she felt, because she didn't want to be left behind by him in that dangerous world. Several anonymous guardians joined the channel to watch how the battle would unfold. Even Senya was surprised by how many spectators were present. They wondered if it was really just a level 8 player trying to face a dungeon boss during the tutorial. Senya confirmed that it was level 8 player Kim Hyukjin. It was an unbelievable sight just to witness everything that was happening. The guardians said those weren't the movements of a mere level 8 player, and wondered if something was wrong. Maybe he was hiding his real level. Senya thought that Hyukjin wasn't moving like a normal level 8 player would. Even so, the player shouldn't be able to defeat the goblin soldier no matter how hard he tried. It wouldn't be the mini-boss who gave in from the weak attacks, but rather Hyukjin himself through exhaustion. The two continued exchanging blows and dodges until Hyukjin shouted for Manhwa to kill them, surprising the smaller monsters as she suddenly began fighting back, killing each one of them by herself and earning multiple experience points in a row. The administrator was caught off guard by her reaction to the danger. At the same time, Hyukjin reached level 9 and recovered from all the damage he had taken, also increasing the durability of his sword, which was still relatively weak. That's because leveling up not only improved their stats, it also fully restored their health and removed all status effects and ailments from the players. This was exactly what Hyukjin had planned to use to let them recover mid-battle. Hyukjin told Manhwa to keep her distance from them so she could prepare. If Manhwa shared the experience while still fighting the goblin mini-boss, she would become even stronger, able to recover her health, wounds, and fatigue through leveling up. Once that happened, the opportunity for Hyukjin to defeat the goblin boss would surely come. He would exploit the goblin's most basic weakness, striking them from behind in their exposed necks. With his current experience by observing his status condition, he achieved his goal. Everything depended on how many small monsters Manhwa could kill. The more she leveled up, the greater their chances of defeating that dungeon and its boss. Suddenly, the dungeon boss landed a strike on Hyukjin. He realized that was a blow he'd need to absorb with his own body for now. But eventually, he managed to level up to 10, allowing him to recover from the heavy damage he had just taken from the goblin boss. Hyukjin struck the goblin boss again as his rusted sword's durability improved even further, dealing more damage to the boss and finally gaining the perfect opportunity. He finally lands a strike on the back of the goblin boss's neck, but his rusty sword ends up breaking. The system congratulates them because they were able to defeat the goblin boss. Hyukjin killed the mini-boss known as the Goblin Soldier. Thus, he officially became the first player to defeat and hunt a monster mini-boss. He gains the experience as the system announces that the level cap within the tutorial field is 10. At least 5 players were recommended inside the dungeon for that tutorial raid. The system recognized the raid as a solo raid. The tutorial field's level restrictions were removed and leveling up was now allowed. It also unlocked a special qualification condition that had been fulfilled. Hyukjin ends up letting Sunwo hug him out of excitement, because both of them were able to defeat the monsters in the end. Sunwo had really done a great job from start to finish. The protagonist realizes that this special condition was probably where the hidden boss was located, and he thinks he doesn't know what the qualification item was. It seems like it's some kind of issue they'll have to deal with eventually too. Near Guangwoman, several wolves were gathering and being defeated by other players, giving them a chance to earn experience and surprising the onlookers. That player finishes the monster with a single strike. It was very impressive considering those wolves were level 8, and everyone praised him for his incredible skills. Even though that player was quite humble while receiving the compliments, they mentioned they're calling Yuyeon the strongest in the tutorial, which makes Yuyeon quite embarrassed from receiving so much attention. Yuyeon ends up seeing Hyukjin and Sunway in the distance, and realizes they were other survivors, so he calls out to them. The protagonist quickly notices that man. The one calling to them was that great player who, in the future, would be recognized as a very important and crucial figure. There was one thing that had never left his mind since it all began. He always wondered if he really never had any talent as a player. He thought that after managing to kill a monster boss alone like that, his only conclusion was that it was impossible for him to have no talent at all. Even counting everything Hyukjin knew about the future, his chances of being able to participate in a dungeon were 50-50. The nameless observer still had a great deal of interest and admiration for him. He was impressed by his willpower and focus in battle. Judging by how things had been developing, Hyukjin still didn't know his own limits, especially with so many guardians nearby watching him. Among the guardians, now the Lady of Scales had also taken an interest in Hyukjin. She was a guardian who aligned closely with kind-hearted people. Unlike the brave Lion King, that guardian prioritized the safety of players and supported them. She was quite famous for giving many safe and worthy donations. With her rewards and great support, she was a guardian many players truly liked. And somehow, that famous guardian had begun to show interest in him. He wonders if it was because he was traveling with Sunwa now. For some reason, the guardian thought he had done a good deed by helping a child who had been abandoned by others. Senya tells Hyukjin that she will grant him a reward for having defeated that mini-boss in the dungeon. It was a standard quality steel sword with average durability and attack power. Hyukjin realizes that this sword was twice as good as his old rusty one, which was quite decent, and Sunway asks what they should do now. They would be heading to Cheonggyecheon now to hunt Neutral City wolves. Sunway gets curious because he referred to wolves instead of foxes, and Hyukjin explains that in general, the city wolves were all level 7 and above. Their leaders were around level 9 too, being much larger than the foxes. Those two types of monsters were good enough to hunt. If they could chase down a bunch of them, the two of them would be enough to hunt those creatures. Sunway asks when Hyukjin learned that information. He explains that before meeting her, he had heard it from other people, which makes her agree even while pausing to think about what she heard. In truth, Hyukjin's original plan was to wait in a nearby safe zone until the first King Yuyeon launched an attack on the second floor of Tower D. The dungeon in Tower D would end up affecting the entire territory they were in, and the dungeon that the two of them had just cleared was only the first floor of it. After clearing it, the local attacks would stop happening around that area. Since Hyukjin had gained the ability to clear it, anyone could continue surviving until the end of the tutorial as long as they stayed within the safe zone. The protagonist was thinking about going beyond mere survival. After discovering that he had some talent as a player, earning $1 million to help his family became a very realistic goal. After leaving the dungeon, the protagonist kept reflecting on everything that had happened, even after gaining a talent following the completion of that tutorial and the return in time. Or maybe it was something he had always had, but now he would try to use it to his advantage. Then they encountered Yuyeon, who approached and asked if there were more survivors. That made Hyukjin think that after all this time, they finally had the chance to meet. Even though it was their first time seeing each other in person, he could still recognize Yuyeon. This was the first king, So Yuyeon. Later, he would become known as one of Korea's 8 most famous players. The protagonist replied that they were indeed survivors. Yuyeon mentioned that they must have had a hard time surviving, surprising Hyukjin because Yuyeon had managed to save a large number of people during that time inside the tutorial. It was obvious how striking he was as a player even from the start. That hadn't changed, not even after going back in time. Yuyeon suggested they travel together with them from now on. After all, the more survivors stuck together, the better their chances of surviving in that world. But Hyukjin ended up refusing the offer, which left all of them shocked. He responded that they only needed to survive for 1 week inside the tutorial territory, and even with just 2 people, they could handle the situation easily. Yuyeon felt it was truly a shame, but there wasn't much they could do. He simply wished the best for Hyukjin and Sunwa. The others whispered among themselves that Hyukjin seemed a little arrogant, considering they had no idea of Yuyan's true strength. Teaming up with them would greatly increase their chances of survival compared to wandering alone. The protagonist mentioned that if they encountered a powerful and dangerous monster, they should aim for its left eye, which left Yuyan a little confused, but he thanked him anyway for the strange tip. Hyukjin walked away and headed toward Cheonggyecheon. Sunhwa asked if those people would really survive and be okay. He replied that most of them would, but Yuyan was especially strong. The girl was relieved even though they should only be worrying about themselves. Even so, things wouldn't go as smoothly as he had predicted, because according to the marked memories of the first king in the future, a certain event was fated. So Yuyan and the 10 or so survivors who entered the D-rank tower dungeon with him would all be caught in great danger. The players who conquered the first room would try their luck in the second as well. But due to the number of enemies that began appearing, most of those people would end up dead. As the time limit of the raid ended, the only survivor of the entire dungeon was Yuyan. That was when he received the title of Tutorial Finisher, the first person to clear the D-rank tower dungeon. But the first king's memories revealed more things later on. From that day forward, bringing people to that second floor tower dungeon became Yuyan's greatest regret. Now there was no guarantee that things would unfold the same way as before. But the protagonist hoped that with his little tip, the casualties could be fewer. Still, Hyukjin didn't want to join them knowing the risk. They might end up losing their lives during that time. Sunhwa pointed out that something was ahead of them. It was some of those wolves they had been looking for. Hyukjin thanked her for her hard work in spotting the creatures from so far away, and suggested they go hunt them immediately. The two charged at the wolves, and Sunhwa used her taunt skill so she could swing her baseball bat, doing exactly what she knew she had to do in order to face the creatures as effective bait. Hyukjin would keep doing what was necessary as well, not just clearing dungeons in the tutorial, but taking advantage of the condition that there were no more level restrictions inside the tutorial. As long as those conditions held, you would take the opportunity to go beyond level 10. Hyukjin and Sunhwa killed several of the neutral city wolves. The girl realized that the baseball bat was much more comfortable to use than her bare fists. It had really been a good idea to follow Hyukjin's suggestions and pick up that weapon for battles. Meanwhile, Hyukjin kept defeating the monsters as well, finally reaching level 11 and becoming the first player to achieve that milestone. Sunhwa thinks it was only natural for that to happen. It was already hard enough for other people to even reach level 10 that quickly. But Hyukjin did it, and also received a new title called the First Pioneer, which makes him wonder what exactly was going on. The First Pioneer was an honorable title granted to those who were trailblazers and reached new territories. It granted an extra 20% experience and could also be applied to other titles. Hyukjin is surprised because the conditions for that title were truly amazing, even though he had never heard of such a title before. He was curious that there was a different title available besides Tutorial Finisher. Still, it made some sense considering the level restriction had been removed. Unlike the first time, no one could have claimed it before. It made sense that no one knew about that title. Sunhwa asks if Hyukjin is okay, and he just replies that they should keep going and find more monsters to defeat with their own hands. The administrator simply watches them while speaking with the guardians. Sinya says that, just as she suspected, she discovered something and would report it and ask for confirmation. She seemed pretty irritated with what she had just found out. In the safe zone inside the hospital, Hyukjin and Sunhwa prepared to begin the new invasion and expedition. The protagonist notices that something had made Sinya angry since the day before. He's surprised because she brings up the title he received. Hyukjin agrees that he did indeed get one, and Sinya asks which title it was, but he refuses to say. Even the guardians wouldn't know what the player's title was unless he said it out loud. There was a lot of pressure on her shoulders now because she had to find a way to discover it. Hyukjin was aware of that, knowing she must be in trouble. There was no need for him to say anything specific this time. Maybe it was better to keep the spectators curious. Sunhwa asks if they're going to Cheonggyecheon again like last time, and Hyukjin agrees because they'd be heading there again the next day. Meanwhile, near Jadmo Wangwoman, Yuyan decides to announce something to everyone who was following him. He says that maybe they had already heard about it before, but they had information about a dungeon nearby. They didn't know how dangerous it might be inside that dungeon. There was no denying that after the big change in that world, great rewards awaited them. Yuyan declares that he would like to enter that dungeon. Several other people say that if he's going in, then they'd like to go in too. They want to help him earn a good opportunity to overcome the dangers that awaited. Yuyan shouts for everyone to get excited about advancing into the dungeon and to prepare themselves to beat it, making everyone determined to achieve victory. Meanwhile, in Cheonggyecheon, Hyukjin and Sunhwa continue killing wolves from the neutral zone and gaining experience. The girl mentions that they've been able to hunt those monsters really quickly since then. The protagonist explains that it was because they had killed them over and over again. That was the second day in a row they'd been in the city just hunting those wolves, and Hyukjin managed to reach level 12 in the blink of an eye. That way they could hunt them faster than the monsters could even respawn. They've been getting several drops and coins as rewards for killing the monsters, including the fang of a mutant wolf worth over 6,000 coins. In the process, someone notices the presence of another wolf walking in the distance, and Hyukjin knows that one must be the last one in the area, killing it quickly with a single blow. But suddenly a different notification appears. They had fulfilled all hidden qualification conditions to unlock something special, which makes Hyukjin nervous. The system announces that the 3 conditions were obtaining a secret item, reaching level 12, and hunting 500 city wolves. It was concerning. He had been trying to stay as far away from danger as possible, but even so, they had managed to unlock the Wolf King lycanthrope. Hyukjin yells for Sunhwa to run, and the two of them quickly flee. The girl asks what's going on, but the protagonist doesn't have time to explain and just focuses on escaping. Lycanthrope emerges from a portal, activating his skill called Howl, which affects the player's bodies. Sunhwa ends up falling during the escape and apologizes because her body was affected by the monster's ability. So Hyukjin tells her to hide behind the car that was nearby, but she gets worried and asks what exactly he's planning to do now. Hyukjin shouts for her to do it quickly. After all, he knew there was a secret item that could be unlocked after certain requirements were met, although he never expected to encounter Lycanthrope during the tutorial. That was a boss monster whose abilities would be on par with the second floor of Tower D's dungeon. They look similar to those monsters, or perhaps even more powerful than that. Hyukjin could barely see its level, given that his own level was far too low. He usually knew those were monsters with levels between 20 and 25. Certainly, it was an opponent that should never have appeared in the tutorial. He wondered what exactly he was supposed to do now in such a troublesome situation, when the level gap was too great for a low-level player to defeat it. It was also too late to just turn around and run away again. The protagonist drank the Grand Elixir, temporarily increasing his strength by 6 points. He would have to use the raid method of the great explorer Jackson to win and lure the boss toward him. When the boss charged at the protagonist, Sunhwa grew concerned. She had tried to hide as instructed, but she still didn't know if Hyukjin would be okay fighting alone. The unknown level lycanthrope was terrifying. She was shocked that there was a monster whose level couldn't even be seen. It looked very different from all the other monsters they had hunted so far, so she wondered what exactly Hyukjin was thinking of doing. Not seeing the level of that monster was the system's way of saying it was an opponent that couldn't be defeated at their current level. The level difference between them had to be 10 or more, so finding a way to defeat that lycanthrope was impossible. Hyukjin recalled something he heard in a report. It said that low-level players should never encounter monsters like that. Above all, powerful monsters were huge and surprisingly fast as well. The best thing to do is hope you were in a low-level area. That way you can avoid those kinds of encounters as much as possible. However, if you ended up in a situation where a confrontation was inevitable, there was only one solution. It was a method that could ensure your survival. And remembering that, Hyukjin took out a high-grade lubricant from his inventory, which could be used on the blade of his sword or on other surfaces. He knew that the first attack of a lycanthrope would be a great leap, so Hyukjin dodged by slipping underneath it, relying on what he knew. The next strike would be a smooth, sliding motion toward him. He understood exactly when and where to move based on how well its muscles flexed and contracted. Focusing on the shape of the shadows under its feet, Hyukjin threw the lubricant on the ground. This made the lycanthrope slip, allowing the protagonist to charge in and bring it down in one go, all because his strength was higher than usual thanks to the elixir. In that report, it was said that you should use lycanthropes against themselves, doing everything you could to weaken them, one method being to push them into water. That was exactly what Hyukjin did, forcing it into the water. The monster began to thrash inside it desperately, shrinking in size considerably. Sunhwa was very surprised by how things had turned out. The protagonist explained that when a lycanthrope falls into water, it shrinks after swelling up. Now it was no different from the city wolves they were used to fighting, which led Sunhwa to ask if Hyukjin had learned some kind of martial art in the past. He replied that he never had the time for that as he was always studying for exams. She was curious because he always fought so well, like something out of a movie. He had managed to take down that boss quickly with just one move. Hyukjin thought that if he were actually good at fighting, he wouldn't need to use such cheap tricks. The lycanthrope kept howling in the water until Hyukjin struck it with his sword, taking its life and raising his level to 13. The protagonist felt relieved because it ended much easier than expected, and was surprised when his level increased again after defeating the hidden boss. Not only that, he leveled up again to 14 and then to 15. He had successfully hunted the hidden special monster, and thus was granted a hidden special reward, including the title Excellent Hunter, which shocked Hyukjin with how many rewards he received. The Guardian Nameless Observer was surprised by his strategies and added 1,200 coins as a reward. The same went for the Lady of Scales, who was impressed by how much he cared for his companion, awarding an additional 700 coins. The brave Lion King only snorted in frustration at the cowardly methods used to win, and Hyukjin thought the Guardians had ended up donating far more than he expected for that achievement. Even so, he earned many things from the system that would also be extremely useful. He wonders if those things would be useful now that he had reached level 15 in the tutorial. New features would be available, so he calls for Sinya, who appears immediately. That was curious, since it seemed like she had been waiting for the call for quite some time. Sinya confirms that Hyukjin had reached level 15. Therefore, she begins her explanation about the unlocking of the item shop that would now be available. Although he had been expecting it upon reaching level 15, it had been unlocked too early. He was still inside the tutorial, which normally wouldn't allow access to it. Stinia says the item shop could be used by spending the coins he had earned, allowing him to purchase special items. Since they were inside the tutorial zone, the available items were only valid for use within that special zone. Only 4 items could be purchased for now. Hyukchin sighs, but that was expected since they were still in the tutorial. As long as those 4 items were available, it would be enough to take advantage of, including what he received after killing all the monsters. The protagonist had nearly 8,000 coins to spend, and realizes that he might be able to buy a good number of potions. That's when Sinya interrupts him, wanting to ask a question. She wants to know if he has a real name. Hyukchin is confused about what she's trying to learn and asks why he should tell her something like that. Sinya gets frustrated, replying that she simply hadn't been curious about it in the beginning, then asks if he's not planning to check the other rewards that came with the Excellent Hunter title. Hyukchin replies that after finishing with the item shop, he'll check it personally, because that was something he would do on his own without necessarily needing her help. Obviously, he didn't intend to check those things now, just using the status window. He was trying to remain as mysterious as possible, and realized that Sinya must be a complete rookie to suggest things like that without thinking. The Excellent Hunter title was a special one that could only be acquired during the tutorial. It applied as long as the target was a non-sentient organism recognized by the system. That title gave a 20% bonus to calculated damage, a 10% increase in speed, and a skill called Hunter's Strike. There was a small chance the hunter's target would completely ignore that skill. But in general, it was a very useful title. Non-sentient monsters only applied to low-level monsters, not to mention that new skills made available could also be used frequently. Hyukchin tells Sunhwa to get ready to leave. They would be attempting to invade the second floor dungeon of Tower D. Sunhwa asks if he's referring to the tutorial dungeon where they had hunted the goblin soldier some time ago. When the protagonist agrees, she's surprised, because Hyukchin had said earlier that the second floor was especially dangerous. The protagonist agrees with her observation. Inside the second floor, there was a certain someone who was light years more dangerous than the goblin soldier they had faced before. Meanwhile, Yuiam's group was facing serious difficulties and several people had already died inside the second floor, leaving him in a tense and complicated situation. He wonders what kind of monster that was and how he was supposed to defeat such an absurd creature. Even though Yuiam was deeply wounded, he didn't want to give up now, because he knew it would be the end of everything if he backed off at that moment. And he realizes that even if just once, he had to find a way to attack and win. So Yuiam continues striking the monster but ends up doing nothing. It only takes another hit in return, powerful enough to break his bones. He couldn't believe how that monster remained untouched after taking so many attacks. It felt like he had been fighting a wall all by himself. He would end up dying if he kept going and wonders if there truly was no way to defeat it. Suddenly, Union remembers what Hyukchin had told him some time ago. Something about hitting it in the eye or something like that. At first, he hadn't remembered it because it sounded like a meaningless warning. But before he could think properly, Yuian dodges the monster's strike once, then takes another hit from its left fist, sending him flying and spitting blood. He was in a tough situation and really couldn't win that battle. It was probably the end. The system announces that new players are entering the dungeon and everyone is confused. But Hyukchin and Sunhwa step into the boss zone and the system notifies that there was no maximum player limit allowed. The protagonist simply comments that things really turned out that way again. The boss of that floor was still a magic troll of unknown level. The people around were either injured or already dead. But Yuian was shocked because more people had entered that dungeon only to faint soon after. There were several injured individuals who hadn't died yet. It looked like Yuian had fallen unconscious. Using his inventory, he pulled out some low-grade potions to heal some of those people. A man told them to run because they wouldn't be able to leave the boss zone on that floor after 10 seconds passed. They would only end up dead if they stayed in the monster space, just like the others. Hyukchin told Sunhwa to grab those potions and distribute them to the survivors, including the man who had told them to run. The protagonist said that while he was fighting, she should tell those who recovered to stay low and not move. The man was shocked and asked if he hadn't heard his warning to get out of there immediately. They would only lose more people, and everyone would die. But the protagonist ignored him, thinking that the second floor boss of the D Tower was one of the monsters he knew better than anyone else. Just like the lycanthrope, that boss also had a red name, and its level was hidden, which meant it was difficult to defeat. Trolls were famous for their high vitality and resilience. A troll's magic gave it a boost as a powerful monster, including exceptional physical endurance. Considering it was a monster that didn't take damage unless attacked with armed weapons, only players as tough as Yuian could normally be relied on. But at that moment, Hyukchin couldn't count on his help. When the troll charged at him, one of the wounded cried out to warn the protagonist of the attack, and Hyukchin dodged, knowing that in exchange for its heavy strikes, its movements were still slow. There really wasn't a strategy that could be used to win against that troll boss. All Hyukchin could do was face it head-on. The first king that Hyukchin knew had been able to kill the tutorial monster and finish it before earning the title of tutorial finisher, all because he kept trying to damage his opponent without giving it a chance to recover. Sunhwa was worried about Hyukchin, and the wounded man wondered how he had the courage to keep facing such a dangerous creature. The system notified Hyukjin that he was receiving benefits from his title to help him during the battle. He was able to clearly see the trajectory of his opponent's attacks and could dodge them easily as long as he kept increasing his agility stat, focusing on staying uninjured and continuing to attack the troll non-stop. That was only possible because Hyukjin could recover from any fatigue using the potions he had bought from the item shop. As long as he kept an eye on that, he could continue fighting the floor boss until it fell. It was a battle of endurance and attrition. Watching Hyukjin fight, the people around who were observing were amazed, because he was another player who had appeared just to help them inside that dungeon. They wondered how long the protagonist could keep fighting like that. After all, about an hour had passed since Hyukjin arrived to help them. It was unbelievable that someone could fight alone for so long, making them wonder how it was possible. After all, everyone thought Yuian was a great genius, but Hyukjin was superior. The protagonist consumed another item from his inventory to keep himself going in battle. Thinking that he had managed to face that boss head-on for the first time, he knew how hard it was to deal with that magical troll. Hyukjin had been fighting for nearly 5 hours since then, and that boss was still standing as if nothing had happened. But at last, the system alerted him that the boss's regeneration power had ended. Even the floor boss was now reaching its limit. The protagonist knew that his previous self wouldn't have even considered that the battle could be this hard. But the past was the past. He had moved on from being just Kim Hyukjin, the civil service student, to Hyukjin, the player. He'd need 15 minutes or maybe a bit more to bring it all to an end. Just a little more effort, and he could finish that battle. The brave Lion King then gifted him with a favor, leaving Hyukjin confused. It was a skill called Superb Overhuman Strength, giving him a chance to increase his attack power by 100%. Hyukjin was puzzled by what had just happened so suddenly. Before he could do anything, his strike landed on the enemy with double the damage it would have originally caused, effectively throwing all of his previous calculations out the window. That completely ruined Hyukjin's original plans, leaving him furious at the brave Lion King's decision. All around, people are amazed that Hyukjin was able to take down the floor boss almost entirely by himself. Hyukjin thinks that the guardian, the brave Lion King, must have made that decision on purpose. If he ever had the chance to fulfill his desire to kill the guardians, that one would be first on the list. His original plans to defeat the troll had failed, and now he would have to run. Meanwhile, someone manages to wake Yuian and tries to help him. But the player gets up, worried about what happened to the monster he had been fighting. Sunwa says the monster is right in front of them, but it's being fought by Hyukjin. This surprises Yuian because the troll suddenly begins to emit a different aura. Someone fires an arrow at the boss's forehead and surprises the protagonist. The person who fired it asks if it worked and if the monster was finally killed. The man laughs to himself because he didn't want anyone stealing his kill, laughing at Hyukjin for thinking he could take the credit for raiding the dungeon. But the protagonist tells them to run because he wouldn't be able to save the man who shot the troll. This leaves the man confused, but suddenly the system announces that the troll boss's consciousness has been restricted, and so it has entered berserker mode. Hyukjin shouts for Sunwa to run just as the notification declares that with the boss's loss of consciousness, the boss zone has been lifted. Everyone immediately starts running. Sunwa asks where they're supposed to run, and Hyukjin replies to the escalators. The first floor escalator was a space where only 15 people could move at once. There was no longer any need to wait in order to use it. Meanwhile, the man who fired the arrow at the troll is killed by the boss with a single move of its hand, leaving Yuian shocked by the horrible sight before his eyes. As Hyukjin and Sunwa flee, the protagonist thinks it was all his fault. After all, everything always happened according to the will and entertainment of the Guardians. Players' decisions could never interfere with that. Hyukjin felt responsible for not having taken that kind of thing into consideration from the start. With the magic troll entering berserker mode, a monster's restricted zone was gone, and it was no longer limited to the second floor of the tower. There was no safe place left in the dungeon, except for one, the underground. Hyukjin tells Sunwa that they need to go down, which makes her ask where exactly they were going. He replies that they should use the emergency stairs to reach the underground area of the second floor. That place was now an additional safe zone that they could use. But even before they could descend, Hyukjin notices the troll boss approaching. That must mean all the others who had been in the second floor boss room had died. With a quick move, Hyukjin pulls Sunwa before they're struck by the attack, and they jump off the staircase. Hyukjin tries not to panic. After all, it would only be worse if the troll caught them. For now, they had managed to dodge it. However, he's worried because the second floor was farther away than expected. Soon, they finally spot the door that would lead to the emergency exit. The system notifies that it recognizes the critical situation, and confirming that the situation aligns with the tutorial field, it is now classified as a special encounter, forcing the awakening of his innate skill. Hyukjin realizes that even without looking back, he can still feel the presence of the floor boss approaching them. His innate skill called Sixth Sense is forcibly awakened. With the boss's attack incoming, the protagonist thinks he's about to die, but the one who ends up taking the hit is actually Sunwa. During that run, Sunwa had been worried about Hyukjin's life. That's why she knew and felt that they would all end up dead at that pace. She couldn't block the attack, but at the very least, she wanted to do something so the protagonist wouldn't die. So she stepped forward to take the hit herself. Seeing that, the Lady of Scales praises Sunwoo for her bravery and decides to gift her with a skill called Platinum Shield, which allows her to use it to block the troll's strike. Sunwoo throws herself in front of Hyukjin to protect him with her shield, but the system notifies her that the Platinum Shield has detected excessive force, and therefore it would eventually disperse from the impact absorbed by her body. Hyukjin realizes that Sunwoo was hurt because of him, and quickly pulls them out of the boss's line of attack, shocked by the awakening of Sunwoo's new ability. Is even more stunned because she ended up unconscious after using that Platinum Shield. What forces Hyukjin to grab her and start running is the need to avoid being attacked by the troll again. He was trying to stay calm because they were almost reaching the safe zone. They just needed to get through the glass door to make it there. As soon as the protagonist throws himself through the glass, he sighs in relief since the additional safe zone of Tower D should be active now, so the floor boss shouldn't be able to get through. When the troll tries to pass, Hyukjin relaxes because it fails to reach them. Even so, there should be some monsters capable of ignoring the safe zones and passing through them. However, that was still impossible for a troll, even in Berserker mode. Hyukjin tries to wake Sunwoo and realizes her arm ended up injured after using it to try and block the troll's strike alone. So he used a potion to help her recover her strength. He didn't know when she had learned that skill, but it was very useful since he only managed to survive thanks to it. If the damage had landed fully on his body, he would have been injured badly enough to damage his brain, and maybe there'd be no coming back. Meanwhile, the troll kept smashing the entrance to the safe zone and screaming. This pissed off the protagonist, and he simply told it to leave and die already. After all, since it was in Berserker mode, it shouldn't have much longer to stay on its feet. And right at that moment, the troll's body suddenly explodes into several pieces. Blood splatters everywhere, finally confirming its death. The system announces that the magic troll was recognized as hunted by the almost level 20 player inside the area. And so Sinia approaches them once again. She tells Hyukjin that the dungeon's conquest reward will go to him. With the death of the tutorial territory boss, the tutorial zone would be dismantled. Her quest was successfully completed. The system notifies that the next difficulty will be determined based on the number of survivors. It was confirmed there were a total of 5,087 survivors in the zone, thus setting the difficulty to low. Hyukjin realizes that was still the same number of survivors he remembered from the last time. Even considering that both he and Sunwoo had survived, he still wondered how the number remained unchanged. Then the system announces that the rewards for the tutorial completion will begin. Thus, the general system rewards will be distributed. Additionally, there would be player qualification, the 1,000 coin reward, and a beginner's defense kit handed out. The individual rewards would be properly delivered by the administrator, and since the tutorial zone had been completely cleared, the level cap would be removed, as well as the title of tutorial finisher granted to whoever completed it. Thus, the title would go to the surviving player located on the second floor of Tower D, granted to Seo Yugyeon, and also recorded in the Hall of Fame. Hyukjin realizes that Yugyeon was the only one who survived the second floor, just as he remembered last time. But that wasn't important right now, so he brings up with Sinia the trade she mentioned at the beginning, and decides to offer her a negotiation in return. The protagonist was determined to do anything to save Sunwoo's life, so he says he wanted her to upgrade his item shop rank right now. But Sinia asks if that's really what he wants, since the item shop would increase its rank naturally over time after the tutorial. He could just wait, but instead, he seemed eager to make a deal for something like that when he could just buy potions. A contract between a player and an intermediate administrator was possible. As long as it followed the rules of contract creation, the Guardian could watch the target player through their intermediate administrator. The more entertainment the player brought through that contract, the better the rewards for the intermediate administrator. The protagonist was already well aware of the problems between Guardians and intermediate administrators, and considering that, as well as the potions he had acquired, he, as a player, should be worth a lot. Either way, he was just focused on giving Sunwoo more time to live. After all, he didn't need a great reason, when he himself would have died earlier to the troll if she hadn't blocked the attack to protect him. Hyukjin owed his life to Sunwoo, and of course he should respond by doing everything he could to save hers. So he prays she wakes up after receiving all those potions. Suddenly, Sunwoo finally wakes up, surprised that she had survived. And Hyukjin replies that she really did survive. It felt like a miracle. She notices the number of potions used beside her, and mentions that Hyukjin once said he would leave her behind if she slowed him down in a dungeon. But the protagonist hesitates to respond. She could barely have dodged that previous attack, and it would have been a waste to abandon her after everything. Sunwoo begins to cry in relief, realizing she wasn't abandoned by him. Hyukjin tells Sinia to begin calculating the player's individual rewards, and she agrees, but before that, the protagonist brings up increasing the rank of his item shop, and asks if they still hadn't created the contract, which frustrates her. The protagonist thinks that if she wanted the system to recognize the contract, she needed a document to prove the agreement, and that once again proved to Hyukjin that she was a complete amateur at her job. Hyukjin says he's only bringing it up because she was the one who failed to prepare the contract. Obviously, it wasn't his fault, she was careless. He simply tells her to read the individual rewards already. Sinia begins with Hyukjin's reward, displaying on the system screens everything he received at the end of the tutorial, which leaves him quite satisfied. The 7 days of the tutorial had finally come to an end. The players who had survived would now receive individual rewards, all depending on their achievements and actions within it. As for the protagonist's rewards, obviously his accomplishments would have been impossible for someone who didn't know the proper strategies from the beginning. But thanks to his influence and knowledge of the future, many things had changed from the original version of the tutorial he once experienced. Hyukjin figured the tutorial rewards would be different from what he remembered because of that, until he received 3 more points in his abilities. Additionally, he noticed that his title had changed as well. Sinya explains that the title Excellent Hunter had been upgraded to Excellent Player, and asks if he'd like to see the effects of that title. Hyukjin agrees, but once again decides to check it himself, frustrating Sinya. The system explains that the Excellent Player title was a special one granted during the tutorial, and that it could be improved after defeating the tutorial boss, also applying to the condition of having hunted every target. Its effects included increasing damage by 20%, boosting movement speed by 20%, and granting a special skill called Excellent Attack. There was a small chance that targets could ignore his attack, and also increase his experience gain by 10%. The protagonist is surprised. He thought receiving the Excellent Hunter title was already good enough. But considering the enhancements of the new title, he ended up receiving far more rewards than before, and wonders if it was really okay to receive something that good just from the tutorial. As for the level up conditions, it all made sense, considering a new player who hunted the lycanthrope had already surpassed level 10, despite being much weaker than the boss. The title change made some sense, even if it wasn't normally something you could obtain. It was impressive that a hidden title like that even existed, but it was nothing compared to his final reward. And that was the transcendence of his Sixth Sense and Death Sentence abilities, fulfilling the condition for fusion. The fusion of the tutorial bonus and his innate ability had given him the Excellent Player title. The fusion of the beta opening bonus and his innate ability gave him the Calm Observer's Eye skill. The protagonist remembers that there were never many records about these fusions, and even those who had seen it didn't know much about it. In general, it was a reinforcement method that could sometimes be achieved by players who reached high hidden ranks. It seemed there were always all sorts of things he hadn't known about the tutorial. Setting that aside, it looked like he had to make a crucial choice. The innate ability he gained from facing the troll, Sixth Sense, could be fused with either the beta opening bonus, which was the Calm Observer's Eye, or with the tutorial bonus, called Excellent Player. He chooses to fuse the 2 received abilities and wonders if it would really work. Then he's surprised when he feels a sharp pain in his body. It felt like his heart was about to explode. Manhwa immediately becomes worried about Hyukjin, and the system warns that intense pain was a side effect of the fusion process. If he couldn't endure it, he would die. The pain was strong enough to make him cough up blood, and Hyukjin gets angry because the system didn't bother telling him about that condition beforehand. Now it was too late, and the protagonist kept suffering from the decision to fuse the abilities. Someone nearly dies of worry seeing that scene and asks what is going on, begging not to die now. Finally, the system announces that the fusion was completed successfully, and the new innate skill called Eye of Perception was generated. But Hyukjin ends up fainting after losing so much blood and feeling so much pain. He suddenly wakes up in a different place, confused about what happened and whether he's actually still alive. He thinks he heard some kind of alarm or something similar, and when he looks to the side, he sees a woman. It was Kim Ayam, his sister. Hyukjin is surprised, especially because there was a system window analyzing her. It was revealed that she was happy and relieved, but also worried. Still, Hyukjin is shocked because nothing about Ayam had changed from how he remembered even 7 years ago. Ayam mentions that he had gone out to study and asks why it took him a whole week to return. She wants to know if he even cared about how much she and their mother had worried during all that time. But without waiting for an answer, Ayam leaves the room and says that as long as he's not dead, everything is fine, which makes him think that she has always been the same tough person, even after a decade. Even though his sister leaves the room, he can still hear her outside, thanks to the use of his innate ability, which had begun functioning after he lost consciousness. Outside, he hears her mumble that Hyukjin should just die already, instead of leaving her worried sick like that for so long. The protagonist realizes that must be why he was able to hear his sister whining outside, and he apologizes internally because he never wanted to hear her cry like that because of him. Hyukjin remembers when he argued with her in the past, begging her not to work in the factory just to help their mother when he himself could do that instead. After all, they could fight to live as a true family. Right now, the protagonist wished he could make that happen, and in this new life, he was still able to see his mother well and alive. She visited him in the hospital room, as did Manhwa, who came running when she heard he had awakened. She throws herself onto him and hugs him while crying with joy because he was alive. Hyukjin sighs, realizing that he really had returned to the past. After those 7 harsh days inside the tutorial, facing horrible events with an extremely low survival rate, he finally managed to survive the past. Now, after going through hell testing his skills and gaining abilities he never imagined. This time, when the portals started appearing again in this world, Hyukjin was ready to change things. And so a month had passed since the great disaster that occurred in Jarno. News reports kept talking about the event. Only 5,000 out of 150,000 people had survived. The recent event known as the tutorial ended only a month ago, but the shock of what happened had yet to fade. Many people still felt despair over losing their friends, families, and loved ones. The reporters always expressed their sympathy for the great losses. For this report, they'd brought a special guest who was responsible for helping many people reach safety, being recognized as the tutorial finisher So Yu-yen. The reporter mentions that according to eyewitnesses, he had played a very active role during the tutorial in saving many lives, using his incredible strength to fight off the horrific monsters, including goblins and wolves from the neutral city with just one punch. He saved several people who would have died. And the reporter even mentions that he received that famous title after his feats, asking what he thought of it. Yu-yen goes silent as he thinks of Hyukjin and Sunhwa, and replies that he just got really lucky. After all, there were others who were the real heroes, which makes the reporter say that was a very humble thing to say. Even including himself, the public believed Yu-yen was the true hero who completed the great tutorial. But Yu-yen knew he wasn't being humble at all. After all, there were Hyukjin and Sunhwa, and he couldn't deny that Hyukjin was in a whole other league as a player for having faced the floor boss alone. Yu-yen himself would have died without Hyukjin's help, and he thinks that he hasn't been able to check yet, but surely the other player must still be alive. At the very least, he hopes so because he needed to repay the favor from that day. Meanwhile, the protagonist was with Sunhwa in front of the opening of a new portal. He knew it would open at the entrance to Seoul Station on June 7th. People around them start running away in panic because they knew monsters would come out of it. They're desperate to survive, but Sunhwa asks if they should go in. The system says that only players could use the portal and at least 7 were recommended to enter. Hyukjin agrees that they were obviously going to enter that dungeon. So both of them go in, prompting the system to announce that they had entered the Seoul Station dungeon. Opening channel 19,207, so the Guardians could watch as well. The protagonist remembers that in the future, once people knew how to clear dungeons, everything became much easier, especially when they faced the D-rank dungeon from the tower. And they could even start calling those small portals real tutorials. Hyukjin asks if Sunhwa still remembered what he told her before they entered. When she agrees, he confirms that they would be advancing inside the dungeon. Sinya mentions that at least 7 players were recommended for that dungeon. She only showed up to warn him of that as the intermediate administrator. The administrator manual states that the Seoul Station dungeon required a small team of players to be cleared. Trying to conquer it alone with just 2 people on the team was extremely dangerous. Sinya asks Hyukjin to retreat and return only once he had recruited enough people. But he ignores her and simply walks out of the safe zone to move forward into the dungeon. Just like he told her in the past, he would show Sinya how to really play in that world. Meanwhile, Yu-yen was in Uedo, the financial district, getting scolded for leaving the way he did, even though he had become super famous to the point of being called for interviews and appearing on TV. Yu-yen apologizes for it, saying he was planning to follow a new path now. And the company owner says it wasn't like their company was shady or anything like most others in the financial district, then just tells him to leave, visibly frustrated for having lost Yu-yen. As he walks out, Yu-yen thinks that the world had really changed a lot since that day 1 month ago. Even though they were no longer in the tutorial zone, small monsters like slimes frequently appeared in the streets, and players who could quickly obtain items gained their own recognized value. They were now starting to get by in life by trading with the shops that were available. Focusing on and investing in players was the fastest way to help change the world. While he was thinking about these things, he suddenly hears a couple arguing that they should run away immediately, because they heard that a dungeon had opened at Seoul Station, the same kind they had seen before in Jongno. Suddenly, another intermediate administrator named Neptune appears to speak with Yu-yen, mentioning that the new dungeon at Seoul Station had finally opened and that it was the first to appear after the tutorial. Neptune says that Yu-yen should enter that dungeon as the well-known finisher of the tutorial. The minimum recommended number of players to enter was 7 and as a team, explaining that he should gather people first. But he quickly stops talking when Neptune realizes that 2 people had already entered the dungeon in that short amount of time. So he continues, saying that it's fine. For now, UVM could simply find more people to form his own team. The system provides an explanation about the creation and destruction of dungeons, saying that when dungeons are created, they self-destruct if not properly cleared. When a dungeon is destroyed, a breach opens and the monsters inside it can escape into the outside world, and only those who were players could enter and clear the dungeon before the time limit ran out. Back in the dungeon at the station, someone begins to talk about the dungeon that appeared, but Hyukjin interrupts and tells her to be very careful where she steps, because the dungeon that opened inside Seoul Station was a very dark cave. Also cold and damp, it could make them slip easily if they didn't take proper care. So he activates his perception eye skill, thinking that since they were still halfway through the dungeon, there was nothing especially dangerous in there that could cause major harm. But even if that wasn't the case in their current state, Hyukjin and Sunhwa could face some difficulties. The protagonist is especially surprised when he looks at Sunhwa's status window, because she had reached level 15 at an astonishing speed. Even though there hadn't been that many monsters around since the dungeon opened, Hyukjin is impressed, because she had clearly been working hard since then. Even though she was just a 14-year-old girl, she had reached level 14. Soon, Sunhwa notices that there was a kind of divider in the path they were taking. They had finally arrived at the crucial section called the Seven Forked Paths, 7 different entrances leading to 7 entirely different places. You could also find 7 different items depending on the path taken. That was the main reason why the dungeon at Seoul Station came with a recommendation to enter with a team of 7 people. If each person were passed through the 7 magical matrices of the entrance, they would still need to be at least level 10. No matter which path they took, they would die if there were only 2 of them. At least that's what Hyuchin thought Senya must be thinking now as she saw them standing before the multiple splits. The protagonist doesn't even hesitate to tell Sunhwa that he'll go ahead and return shortly, asking her to wait there. Sunhwa doesn't hesitate to agree with what Hyuchin says. He then walks through one of the paths, passing the first fork, causing the dungeon to recognize his presence and activate the Neeple path within the dungeon. Despite the awakening of this new dungeon, Hyuchin wasn't afraid at all of what lay ahead. He just kept going deeper into it, eager to explore what else existed inside the Seoul Station dungeon. If someone wanted to clear that dungeon, they would have to clear all available paths. Each of those paths granted a different reward at the end. The big issue was that it was necessary to collect all 7 rewards available at the end of each branch in order to clear the dungeon. But when a player walked into one of the paths within the dungeon, the difficulty would automatically scale to 7 players. If they entered the Neeple path, they would never complete the 7-person quest with just 2 people. That was the hardest way to clear the dungeon, as it had a famous completion method. Since it was one of the first dungeons to appear in the world, there were various methods and strategies for clearing it. Even hidden strategies eventually ended up being made public. There had always been records tracked for players who cleared dungeons with fewer than the intended number of players. The system tells Hyuchin that the Seoul Station dungeon has activated the second charm known as the Diogo path. It was only necessary to take full advantage of the difficulty setting inside it after opening each path. The total of 7 paths, originally locked and programmed for 7 players, would begin to shift. If the difficulty of the first one was set for 7 players, then the difficulty would drop considerably for each parallel opening. Another notification appears, mentioning that the Delincha path inside the Seoul Station dungeon had begun to activate. Until all the paths were open, each one would have the difficulty of just 1 person. After opening all the passages, Hyuchin returns to where Sunhwa was waiting. The condition to clear the dungeon never said they had to clear all the paths at the same time. It was just one big rabbit hole that they could use to their advantage. With that in mind, Hyuchin says it's time to begin the job. So they decide to proceed through the first path, the Nepala passage. Meanwhile, several civilians outside the dungeon were confused by the massive chaos inside. The police blocked off the area, shouting for everyone to stay away, because a disaster was unfolding inside Seoul Station. They directed everyone to follow police orders and evacuate quickly. People were confused about what was going on, but decided to follow the recommendation. Yudian, who was there, knew that a dungeon portal had opened inside the station. Suddenly, the voice of someone clearly abnormal echoed among the crowd, saying this was a very irritating situation. He asked what those police officers thought they were doing by interfering with his livelihood and why they were blocking him. Everyone is shocked by the appearance of the man, who looked nothing like a normal human, especially because he was walking through the air. The police ask who the man is and demand that he identify himself. Yuyan remembers seeing that person before inside the tutorial zone and recognizes him as the intermediate administrator Chris. If the administrator was here, it must mean another player was nearby as well. The police state they will open fire if he doesn't comply and again order everyone not to approach any further. But despite the warnings, Chris approaches the officer visibly annoyed. He lifts him by the neck and asks what exactly he's trying to do now, prompting the other officers to yell for Chris to let the man go and once again threaten him with their weapons. Chris dares them to try, and even though they open fire, a barrier protects him from all the bullets. He returns the bullets at them in a quick motion, setting everyone who fired ablaze. The police scream for everyone to retreat and fall back immediately, which makes him complain that they were just noisy insects bothering him. But now that Chris had managed to clear the path leading into the Seoul dungeon, he mentions that it should be the perfect moment for players to enter. Chris comments that there were actually some pretty famous people there, specifically mentioning Yuvian. Next to Chris, another person approaches, saying it had been a long time since they last saw each other. In truth, he and Yuyan had only seen each other during the tutorial 1 month ago. Yuyan immediately recognizes the player Seo Juwon, who says he can't believe he's running into the great finisher of the tutorial right there as well. Juwon greets Yuyan, and he returns the greeting with hesitation, which makes Yuyan think that just as expected, Juwon had also survived. He had only seen him during the goblin attack, but couldn't possibly forget someone like him. Juwon had been covered in blood and kept stacking goblin corpses again and again. While other people were too busy running for their lives, he was enjoying the reckless slaughter. At first, his behavior scared him, but even Yuyan had to admit he was a very skilled person. Juwon asks if he was also trying to clear the Seoul Station dungeon, but it should have been an obvious question, since there was no way a player of Yuyan's level didn't understand how much that world had changed. Those things would keep appearing forever, constantly changing the world from what it once was. And Juwon says that as long as the opportunity continued, they could still chase after their wildest dreams. It was the perfect chance for players to get their hands on whatever they desired. But since Yuyan doesn't respond, Juwon comments that the administrators said they needed 7 people to clear that dungeon. Since they only had 6 people there, he invites Unium to join them, saying that it would be a great help if they joined forces. Back inside the first path of Nepala, the duo of protagonists found a group of monsters called Black Yaks. Both Hyukjin and Sunwoo took the chance to kill those new creatures. With the provocation of facing a large herd of them, Hyukjin comments that they now had a long job ahead of them, so they should keep hunting and push even deeper into the dungeon. The monsters charge at the protagonists, and Hyukjin uses his sword to kill each one with relative ease, causing multiple consecutive kills and earning several experience points along with coins as rewards. After taking care of a few of those creatures, he realizes he had taken down 30 of them. Sunwoo had successfully finished her battle too. She asked about the skill Hyukjin had used a while ago, the one that sent all the yaks flying, and defeated them quickly without even trying hard to achieve his goal. She wanted to know if anyone could do that, since she had only seen other players hunting. She asked if she herself could learn how to use it too, and Hyukjin replies that maybe she could, giving a discreet glance toward the administrator Senia, since she was probably curious about how things were going. The protagonist whispers to the administrator that with all the guardians watching, he couldn't say anything to Senia, and tells Sunwoo that if she keeps practicing, she might be able to do it someday. Meanwhile, the guardian nameless observer remains silent. The guardian lady of scales seemed pleased, and the guardian whispering demon didn't agree with those actions. Sunwoo asks if just working hard to get stronger would help her learn it, and the protagonist agrees, explaining that practicing to avoid any regret was important. If she could give her best at her best moment, then she would be able to make it possible. At least that was how Hyukjin had done it in his previous life. Sunwoo didn't really understand what he meant, but since Hyukjin was saying it with such conviction, it must be true. She decides to believe in his words. That's when she notices something floating near them, which surprises them both because it looked like some kind of ring. Hyukjin recognizes it immediately, thinking that was the ring, an item he had been waiting to appear for a while inside the dungeon. With that, they had finally finished clearing Nepala's path. Now they could proceed to the next fork. Sunwoo asks if they could really just leave without killing all the monsters, and the protagonist agrees because those weren't monsters that gave much experience, so it wouldn't be worth the effort to kill them all. She thought they had to kill everything to complete the dungeon, just like they had done in the tutorial by killing the wolves in Xiangyexin, and Hyukjin remembered well what she was referring to. But they were going to leave now because it was the best thing to do. That's because they weren't the only ones inside that dungeon. Meanwhile, Juwon's group had entered the portal leading into that dungeon. Juwon himself mentions that this dungeon was very different from the Tower D dungeon. It looked more like a cave system. He still had his memories from inside the tutorial dungeon, from the time he had entered it for the first time, especially since this was the second one they would be venturing into. Juwon asks if it wasn't quite a nostalgic feeling, and Yunyan says he remembers the tutorial dungeon, but they weren't really good memories to recall. More than 10 people who were with Yuyan had lost their lives inside that place. He wasn't strong enough to kill the second floor boss monster, and due to that huge failure, everything had fallen apart with disastrous results. Juwon just smiles at that response and says they should keep moving deeper into the dungeon. The faster they complete and return, the safer it will also be for the ones who entered. They begin to go deeper into the dungeon, and then one of the players mentions the existence of several forks, which leaves them confused about whether they should enter each path in a specific order, especially since one of the paths ahead was glowing among the others. Juwon says they should try the closest one first, the path known as the First Nipple Path. Meanwhile, Hyukjin and Sunwoo were inside another path, and they obtained the second reward for having reached the end of it, thus acquiring the Dugo necklace. The protagonist thinks that this one appeared even faster than the Nepala ring. The two of them should now proceed to the third path, just as Sunwoo had theorized. Hyukjin realizes that Sunwoo must be starting to understand the purpose of each of the key items. After all, collecting them was far more important than killing the monsters. Then Sunwoo suddenly apologizes to him, which leaves him a little confused, but she explains she just realized she was a bit slow. After all, she had been observing how Hyukjin hunted, but she always ended up exhausted. And while she was busy breaking the horn of a single yak, he was always slicing down several monsters at once at an impressive speed. She knew he was strong enough to do all that alone and was starting to wonder if she was becoming a burden. But the protagonist denies it and asks if she has ever seen him do anything useless. The girl says no, and Hyukjin continues by saying that he wasn't being nice to her just because she was a child. And if she understood that, then they should just move on to the third path, to the Delancia path. Sunwoo is surprised because the monsters inside it were level 14 purple yaks. But more than that, they were far more aggressive than the black ones, and one of them charges at Sunwoo. It fires its horns at her head, and Hyukjin asks if she was hurt, but she says no because it didn't hurt. For some reason, something just struck her head quickly to the point where she couldn't even see what it was. Finally, Sunwoo realizes that it was the yak's horns. Hyukjin explains that the purple yaks could launch their horns to attack as a ranged attack. The protagonist assures her that it would be fine. Since she wasn't hurt after the attack, he would leave those monsters to Sunwoo, calling her an excellent tank, which leaves her a little confused by the new role she'd just been given. In the end, several of the yaks begin to launch their horns at Sunwoo, rapidly attacking her head while she struggled to endure the wave of assaults. And Hyukjin praises her, saying that in the end she really did seem capable of blocking much more than he originally thought. Sunwoo complains that he shouldn't be saying those things just because she wasn't getting hurt. After all, she was still scared by the overwhelming number of hits. The protagonist responds that yaks wouldn't cause any injuries to her anyway, so she could use her taunt now to go against them. Sunwoo does as he says and activates her taunt skill, which causes the yaks to attack even more than before, firing more and more horns at her. Suddenly, the attacks stop and Sunwoo looks at the monsters with confusion on her face. Then she realizes they had all collapsed on the ground, and the experience began to be collected and accumulated as the yaks fell. Hyukjin explains that purple yaks always collapse after using both their horns to attack their enemies, which makes Sunwoo understand why they had all suddenly been defeated. Finally, they find what they came for on the third path, which was nothing other than Delanche's bracelet. Hyukjin realizes that only 4 more of those items were missing to complete the dungeon, and Sunwoo asks if they were going to leave now that they had cleared the path and obtained the item again. Those monsters had given a good amount of experience, and Sunwoo was hoping they could hunt the rest. The protagonist insists because he had already explained to her earlier that it wasn't a good idea. That's because there were still other players inside the dungeon too. Instead of killing them all on their own, they should leave some for the others to benefit from as well. The more they left behind, the longer others would take to catch up to the path they were currently taking. And that would also prevent them from crossing paths inside the dungeons. Meanwhile, the players were gathering and struggling to kill even one of the yaks. All of them had to keep moving to avoid the attacks and finally take down a single monster. Even so, Yumyeon's punches were always a big help. With just one strike, he could bring down his enemies and everyone was impressed by his skill. However, most of them were well aware that it was only possible because he was the famous finisher of the tutorial. Joowoon was watching everything very attentively. He mentions that despite it all, their efficiency still wasn't very good, and says the monsters were still tough, so it was a bit difficult to hunt them. They'd only managed to get the horns because they were the weak points of many of them. Several of their bodies were also missing, and even after ending the hunts, they didn't gain much experience from killing those monsters. Joowoon comments that they were getting very mediocre to poor rewards for a dungeon, and asks Yumyeon what he thought about that, to which he agrees, because after all that effort, it didn't seem to be worth it in the end. Joowoon says it was really a bit strange since there was nothing waiting for them at the end of the path. Even after going through it, hunting those monsters, he decides it's better to just keep going instead of stopping, since it would be even more boring otherwise. They realize they should maybe try to reach a different path and proceed to the second path, Dugo's path. That side also had only black yaks, just like the first path. And Joowoon notices that, just like the first, there were some fallen monster bodies and broken horns left on the ground. Yumyeon wonders what exactly Joowoon was thinking now, but it was all because that situation was very strange and different from the usual. Normally, there were titles and various rewards in the dungeon tutorial, which could only mean that they had come all that way looking for a reward, but in the end, got nothing. Or the other possibility was that someone else had been passing through the dungeon before them, taking their rewards. Joowoon realizes that this was quite different from the usual. After all, their team was only able to enter the dungeon after Chris figured out how to get through the barriers set up by the police. But besides that, he wonders if there was even another player capable of clearing a dungeon that quickly besides himself or Yumyeon. After thinking for a moment, Joowoon remembers Hyukjin. Even though they hadn't seen him for a long time, he wonders if he might actually be inside that dungeon right now too. Joowoon then tells the other players that they should all clear the yak path and try another path instead, since there had to be something they were missing. Meanwhile, on the 6th path known as Victoria's Path, Hyukjin and Sunwoo had just finished off a few more black yaks after some effort, and gained more experience as well as the item from that path. They obtained the second-to-last reward item known as Victoria's Shield, which makes the protagonist think that a shield like that would be a good reward for a tanker. But now that he saw it firsthand, it had too little durability to really be used as a shield. They had also acquired Athena's necklace from the 4th path, Athena's Path, Zenith's club from the 5th path, Zenith's Path, and finally Victoria's shield from Victoria's Path. Now they only needed to obtain the heat item from the 7th path. Sunwoo asks if that meant they could finally complete the dungeon, and Hyukjin agrees with her, because that way they could finish and leave. They decide to leave the 6th path and head toward the 7th. But just as they come out, Sunwoo comments that there was something nearby in that direction. That's when they cross paths with the other group of players. The group of players spots the duo, including Yumyeon, and quickly recognizes Hyukjin. The protagonist knew that eventually they would be able to find them, but still it happened much later than expected, which only proved they were beginners. Among them, Joowoon smiles upon seeing that the people there were exactly who he had theorized earlier, the ones he calls the rat duo. Hyukjin realizes that that group of players entered the dungeon after them, but still wonders how Yumyeon ended up associating with them. Yumyeon mentions that he never expected they'd run into each other again in a place like that, thus revealing his player profile. He had just reached level 17 and had some skills, including a strange personality of being both generous and narrow-minded at the same time. Hyukjin focuses on Joowoon as he approaches to talk, commenting that it looked like they had some companions inside the dungeon. Juwon says they passed by some of the monsters that Hyuchin and Manhwa had hunted, and asks if it was really their work clearing that part of the dungeon, to which the protagonist agrees. Being 10 years in the past, Juwon looked much younger, but was still the same as Hyuchin remembered from the future. That's because there was a player organization that sometimes acted under the name Nightmare. Also known as the Demon King's Army, they had great combat power capable of facing the 8 heroes, committing vicious atrocities that could not even be described with words. They were practically a group of lunatic players who enjoyed committing atrocities. Among them was Seo Juwon, a self-proclaimed unusual homicidal maniac, particularly famous within the Demon King's lunatic army for his vicious acts. Hyuchin was quite aware that he would eventually run into one of them someday, but he hadn't expected it to happen so soon, right in the second dungeon. Juwon says they really managed to progress quickly, and asks if it was just the 2 of them who had been clearing the dungeon. Hyuchin agrees that the 2 of them alone were more than enough. Juwon responds that the results speak for themselves in proving both of their abilities. After all, they had seen their hard work up to now and the path they left behind. He continues, saying the dungeon was originally recommended for a team of 7 players, and asks if that didn't mean they would need more people from that point on. But Hyuchin replies that they would eventually find out whether they could proceed or not, and asks directly what exactly Juwon was trying to imply. The players begin to get angry at Hyuchin's tone, but Juwon interrupts them, saying he had a proposal to make to the protagonist, explaining that including himself, everyone in that group was quite experienced in hunting compared to most of the other survivors. They could find a way to clear the dungeon together now that they had coincidentally met. It would surely be much safer and faster to take that route, both for them as a group and for Hyuchin and Manhwa. Juwon says they were also looking for a way to share the rewards so that everyone could be happy. No one could claim ownership of the dungeon. It would be the best way to act, and Juwon ends by hoping he would make the right decision. Hyuchin ends up agreeing with the proposal, but with a single condition, that the 7th key from the Lakachula path would be sold by him. The group of players gathers as one and enters the Lakachula path, beginning the hunt against the yaks that were being slain, thus accumulating experience. The other players shout that there were even more yaks ahead and they should all group up to kill them, which makes Manhwa think that it really was much faster to tackle dungeons with everyone together. Still, something felt off. She notices that Hyuchin's movements were slower and less efficient than usual. After all, earlier he had been pushing himself hard to handle everything alone and hadn't seemed to have any problems. Now he looked strangely exhausted, which made her wonder if he was really okay. Meanwhile, Juwon had been wondering what kind of trump card Hyuchin was using, since he was able to clear the other dungeon paths so quickly. But it was surprising because Hyuchin seemed like a much more average player than he initially thought. Despite considering the fatigue he was showing, he still didn't seem as skilled as he originally believed. Then they finally obtained the Lakachula earrings, and Juwon realizes that was the key item that had been mentioned earlier, and he thinks that they really just looked like useless items. They didn't seem to have any special abilities or anything like that, and their durability was ridiculously low. Juwon wonders what exactly was so special about that item for Hyuchin to be interested in it. The protagonist quickly approaches and asks if they managed to get the item in question. Juwon hands the earrings to Hyuchin, saying that no matter how he looked at them, they still just looked like old earrings, and asks why he would be interested in something like that. Hyuchin replies that he only needed those items to be able to clear the dungeon, but they had to be picked in the correct order and only the first player to collect them could receive them. And he himself had all 7 key items, which should now allow them to complete the dungeon. He then gives Juwon what he had promised, 500 coins as a reward. Juwon is surprised that he had that many coins. It was impressive, because he would have had to kill at least 40 of those yaks to have that much. Juwon laughs and realizes it would be relatively easy to find a way to rob him. He then responds with a laugh that it was honestly a relief that Hyuchin kept his word. He also mentions that he would do everything he could to help them until they left the dungeon. The protagonist replies that now that he had offered, there was still much more to be done before completing the main quest. Juwon tells the other players that they could all follow Hyuchin to the end of the path, which makes Manhwa a bit tense about the way things were unfolding. She asks if it was really okay to do this. After all, he seemed more tired than usual, and she just wanted to make sure he was okay. But Hyuchin responds that she shouldn't worry because it was nothing serious. Manhwa worries that maybe she had just seen something wrong at the end. In truth, Seo Juwon was a problematic type of player. Even though he was level 16 and had a personality visibly intimidating to anyone who got close enough to see, thanks to Hyuchin's perception eye ability, he knew all about his dark and twisted thoughts, especially knowing about his blood-soaked future, though the roots from 10 years ago already seemed equally bad. He wonders when Juwon's true personality would finally be exposed to everyone, letting that mask he always wore fall and allowing his real self to emerge. Walking deeper into the dungeon, they finally reach its end, entering the Menorah Square. Upon entering, the statue of Menorah opens its eyes to them. Hyuchin knew that once all 7 paths were cleared, a Menorah Square would always appear. That was another reason why the Seoul Station dungeon was known as the end of the line for low-ranked players in his original timeline. Manhwa is immediately frightened by the sight of the statue. But Hyuchin thinks that for a name like Final Destination, it was actually quite simple. no one ever figured out how to move past Minora's statue from that point on. Soon, the statue begins speaking to the players, asking who dared to disturb its slumber. Yuyan is surprised when the statue begins to speak, and Minora says that those without the qualifications to enter the space should leave immediately. If they choose to stay, punishment would not be withheld. Hyukshin continues forward, thinking that he hadn't come all this way just to give up now. The protagonist answers that he came to prove he was qualified, and so the statue begins to emit a strong glow, telling him to prove himself to it. Then a system screen appears before his eyes with several points. The statue tells him to take the test of qualification. He had to pass that test in order to proceed and clear the Seoul Station dungeon. A single mistake could mean the end of everything. Any kind of error could end up killing and destroying the challenger's heart. The first challenge was exactly the first path he had entered, and so he opens his inventory to retrieve all the items collected inside the dungeon. Equipping the key items on the Minora statue in the correct order followed the order of the paths they had taken. So he begins by offering the Ring of Nepala, followed by Diogo's necklace, Delanche's bracelet, and all the others until finally completing the challenge and filling all the required slots. As each item was placed, the statue was adorned with those same key items. It was decorated with each accessory perfectly. At last, Minora declares that he had proven himself worthy, just as expected. The challenger must now answer the question of what its name was. This makes him recall the strategies used in his timeline to complete that quest, where it was said that Minora or Mandra is a word that meant stables. The Minora statue was basically a guardian of the stables, with only a single mission, where the wild fields of the 7 paths were filled with all of her yaks. The owner of those fields and paths was hiding something there, and the statue of Minora was the guardian of that hidden treasure, waiting for the return of her master. When entering the Seoul Station dungeon to find the hidden reward left behind by the stable's owner, one needed to give a different answer than their own name in order to receive the hidden treasure left inside. It was necessary to answer that he was her master, the one who gave Minora a new life, introducing himself as Rancher. The players are all confused by Hyukshin's answer, but finally Minora greets her master and creator, triggering the system to notify him that he found the correct answer, and also completed the secret quest inside the dungeon. Hyukshin feels relieved because he finally managed to accomplish it. The observer Your Name shook his head, the Lady of Scales was surprised, and the Whispering Demon was quite entertained. All the players are impressed by Hyukshin's answer and the result it brought. Manhwa feels relieved because apparently everything went well. The players ask what exactly happened and what he meant by answering that he was her master. They don't understand what kind of notification that was which they all suddenly received. But despite everything, they were relieved because things ended well after all. Yuyan thinks he had been worried something bad might happen, but in the end, Hyukshin really wasn't an ordinary player at all. Minora responds that there were items her master had left for her and asks him to choose one and leave. The system tells Hyukshin to choose a reward. Among them were Minora's gloves, Minora's fine sword, and Minora's breastplate. Those were all special rewards from the Seoul Station dungeon, and they would certainly be of great help if obtained early on. Hyukshin thinks that considering the place they were heading next, the best choice right now would definitely be one in particular. But suddenly Ju-won approaches, commenting that it looked like he got some pretty interesting rewards this time and congratulates him. Ju-won continues, saying that he wasn't able to see what the specific rewards Hyukshin could choose from were. The protagonist agrees, saying it would just take a little time, only a minute or so to sort everything out. Ju-won then says if that's the case, then it's fine, and once he's finished, they could leave the dungeon. Hyukshin uses his eye of perception and senses Ju-won's gaze still on both him and Manhwa. He definitely had a disgusted look on his face now, targeting Manhwa, who was the weaker among them and would certainly make a good hostage. Ju-won thought Hyukshin couldn't see him, but that was a huge mistake on his part. Hyukshin says he has chosen his reward and decides to take Minora's gloves. The statue proceeds to give him the item as selected. Minora's gloves were a special item with a unique tolerance to poisons, and they protected the wearer from various types of infections, giving him +2 defense and +3 poison resistance. Minora says she hopes it is a useful gift to help him continue on his journey, allowing the system to finally announce that they had completed the quest in Minora's square. The next quest stage was called the Forked Path, which makes some way especially curious since it looked like there were 2 paths to follow. The quest said that the Seoul Station dungeon still had one last path. They had to figure out how to complete that dungeon. If they failed, it would collapse immediately, and at least one player had to enter each of the passages. Hyukshin agrees that there were still final paths they had to go through, which also meant that the Seoul Station dungeon was nearly at its end. Manhwa asks if they'd be going home after that. He replies that it wasn't over yet, so she shouldn't lower her guard and should stay close to him for now. Manhwa promises she'll stay by his side, but Ju-won interrupts them to say that he's disappointed because they were supposed to be cooperating with each other. He felt like they were just following Hyukshin's orders. Not everyone agreed with that kind of path to follow. In the end, it felt a bit excessive, and Ju-won says they should split into 2 groups to proceed through the paths. He suggests they should do that properly now. Hyukshin responds that if that's how Ju-won sees it, then he and Manhwa could clear one side alone. as Ju-won should have already seen the two of them were more than enough to handle one side. Ju-won scoffs that he had overwhelming confidence and asks how he could guarantee that just the two of them were enough. It was good to be confident in your skills when entering new places, but even so, Ju-won didn't believe that would last until the end of the dungeon. Hyuk-jin agrees that he might have a point, noticing that Yoon was visibly bothered by this situation and the words he heard, clearly sounding like a personal attack about what happened in the tutorial. Hyuk-jin asks if Ju-won thought they should split into groups to explore, and he agrees, explaining that they should plan the division according to the best kind of balance, a team of 3 on one side and a team of 4 on the other, to be a good setup. The team could be determined by placing the tutorial finisher, Yoon, who would provide good balance to the team of 3. And with that in mind, Ju-won suggests that he be the leader of the 3-person team. Yoon is surprised by that, but Ju-won continues, saying that Sunhwa should be placed in the 4-person team so she could tank for them. Ju-won asks what they think of the idea, visibly making Sunhwa uncomfortable. But Hyuk-jin openly says that he hated the idea, pulling Sunhwa closer to him. That makes Ju-won ask what exactly he meant by that response and demands an explanation for his obvious rejection. Hyuk-jin answers that he wasn't convinced their team could do anything. He was just making his personal opinion clear on the matter. He explains that Sunhwa was like his younger sister, and he didn't plan on leaving her side until they cleared the dungeon. Ju-won understands that they intended to stay together from beginning to end. Then he says he's starting to see where all that confidence of Hyuk-jin's was coming from, and asks if perhaps a guardian gave them some kind of benefit or information for them to be acting like that. Stenia is shocked and becomes even more surprised when Hyuk-jin simply agrees, even though it wasn't true. The protagonist thinks that even though his knowledge came from the future, he could never tell anyone that, and he knew that the source of his knowledge didn't really matter. The system notifies that some of the guardians are curious about the origin of that information. Hyuk-jin thinks they were all shameless bastards. If they were really curious, they should just give some kind of useful information themselves. Ju-won says that if that was the case, then he understood why Hyuk-jin was so confident. They would give up on taking Sunhwa into their team. Even so, Ju-won says Yoon should join their group, because that way everything should go smoothly as long as they split that way. The protagonist responds that he has no complaints about that. Yoon agrees to join that group too, so they could all meet again at the end of the split paths, and Ju-won walks away from them, wishing them good luck with a malicious smile. The system announces that they are entering the first path, and tells them to reach the end of the path, stating that the clues to clear the dungeon were all at the end of the path. Since fewer than 5 people had entered, a temporary safe zone was created for them, and Sunhwa asks if they should just walk straight to the end of the path. Then Yoon steps forward and asks if he was the one who appeared on the 2nd floor of the Tower D dungeon while they were fighting the magic troll, mentioning that they didn't even have the chance to meet again after Chiang Yechin. He says it had been a bit hard for him to remember, since they had only met a few times. But he was always with that girl and thought Hyuk-jin must have been someone else when he didn't even come close to talk. Now he was sure he remembered exactly who he was. Hyuk-jin was surprised that Yoon recognized him, and agrees that he was right but asks why he was bringing that up now. And Yoon bows, thanking him for saving his life, which surprises both of them in that whole scene. He explains that to him, Hyuk-jin was like a hero. If he hadn't found a way to drive off the magic troll that day on the 2nd floor, he would have definitely died. The protagonist thinks he was just trying to run away because he didn't want to die either, but it seemed like things had been misunderstood. Yoon says Hyuk-jin might be surprised to see that from him, but the truth was he would never forget that favor. The system itself confirms it by showing that he was offering sincere respect and thanks to Hyuk-jin. Yoon even asks for a chance to repay Hyuk-jin with any kind of favor he might need, which makes the protagonist think it was almost funny how honest he was being. And he never expected to hear something like that from the great first king, especially when he was offering a favor. For some reason, it still didn't feel real to Hyuk-jin. Hyuk-jin replies that he'll keep that in mind, and Yoon thanks him, asking if he could call him Big Bro from now on, which shocks the protagonist, since they were supposed to be the same age, and it felt like an overly exaggerated way of showing respect. But Yoon assures him that he doesn't care about age because Hyuk-jin saved his life and is a great hero. The protagonist just agrees if that's really how he wants to act. Yoon asks him to also speak casually with him and start calling him Big Bro from now on. This makes Sunhwa happy with a friendly interaction between them. As they move further into the dungeon, Hyuk-jin realizes they finally reached the crystal needed to clear the Seoul Station dungeon. As expected, it was still intact. Hyuk-jin tells the 2 players to sit down and rest because they would need to do something tiring soon. Yoon asks if it was really okay for them to just sit there and rest. The protagonist assures him it's fine because the area was temporarily marked as a safe zone, so it was all good. They could take care of the crystal later. The best way to do it was to conserve stamina while inside dungeon raids. Yoon notices that Hyuk-jin is still speaking formally and even frowns, demanding that he speak informally. The protagonist agrees, wondering how Yoon always managed to get so intense out of nowhere. Sunhwa asks if she was like his younger sister, then what exactly should she call Yoon? He replies that she can call him however she wants, and she decides to just keep calling him the same as always. Hyukjin thinks that the way Samwa addresses them, calling them Appa, is how people in Korea usually refer to an older brother. She decides to do the same for Hyukjin. Samwa replies that she'll be calling him Mr. Yuhyun, which leaves him totally shaken because it felt like she was speaking to someone way older. Hyukjin sighs, thinking kids in that era really were funny. Yu even asks if the crystal would really wear them out that much and if it was that difficult to deal with. And Hyukjin explains that clearing the crystal is directly connected to clearing the dungeon, since taking that final step in the dungeon raid could trigger some sort of trap prepared for them. In fact, there was another problem they needed to solve first. The scene then shifts to Ju-won's group on the other side of the dungeon. They end up discovering an entrance and some kind of button. The system warns that now that there are more than 5 participants, the temporary safe zone would be removed, and the players are surprised by this. Hyukjin tells them to get up because they're going to have to fight some guys now. At the same time, Ju-won's group also approaches. They ask if they hadn't finished clearing that path yet. He mocks them, saying that even though Hyukjin had been acting confident, it seemed like they were pretty slow. It was a bit disappointing. The protagonist says there's no reason to be disappointed because they were just waiting for Ju-won's arrival. Hyukjin says he knew they'd been planning something like this from the start. Ju-won scoffs that he's acting again like the guy who always knows everything. He was trash from beginning to end, striking with his sword at Hyukjin. Ju-won says he should have at least tried to be a bit more humble, especially if he knew he'd end up dying in his hands in the end. Hyukjin asks in return if he'd even be able to kill him, throwing the insult back. And so Hyukjin and Ju-won begin exchanging sword blows rapidly. Ju-won asks what's wrong and where all that confidence he had before went during the battle. After all, the protagonist was only dodging and trying to defend instead of striking back. Ju-won mocks that it's a shame for Hyukjin and asks if those were really all the skills he had accumulated to show. This makes Yuhyun and Samwa worry because he ended up hurting his hand in the process. Ju-won asks if he really had time to be paying attention to anything other than the fight. Soon, the other players try to go after Yuhyun and Samwa, but the one who attacks complains that he missed his hit and starts mocking Yuhyun. He asks if Yuhyun really thought he deserved all that reputation, and the others comment among themselves that all of them had also been getting used to fighting since then. But dealing with someone pathetic and cowardly like Yuhyun would take less than 5 minutes when they had the numbers. They didn't even need to try hard. They were confident because they hadn't done anything like that for a whole month, and they wonder how much fun they could have facing Yuhyun now. They laugh at Yuhyun, saying that if he lets his guard down, they'll definitely find a way to kill Samwa. If he wanted to survive, he just needed to hand the girl over to them. After all, he might be good with his fists, but he shouldn't be able to handle 2 players at the same time. Meanwhile, Ju-won says it would be pretty boring if Hyukjin just kept defending, and asks if there wasn't anything else he could do to make things more interesting. After all, he seemed to be about the same level when it came to fighting monsters, but for some reason he seemed like a complete newbie when it came to fighting other players. The Whispering Demon was enjoying the scenes of insults that Hyukjin was receiving, but Ju-won keeps saying that, unfortunately for Hyukjin, he was especially used to fighting useless players. The protagonist simply stands up and replies that from what he could see, it didn't look like Ju-won was capable of using shadow ambush, so he still wasn't as good as he claimed to be. That makes Ju-won angry, telling him to keep that arrogant attitude so he wouldn't feel too bad when he kills him. Even so, Hyukjin says that would be the last time he would ask, but insists on knowing if he really would kill them if he didn't hand over Samwa. And Ju-won replies that he would only let him live if he gave her up first. But now he had decided to kill him and take Samwa either way, regardless of his decision. So Hyukjin charges at Ju-won and presses something against his chest that makes him cough up blood. And he comments that he should remember what he's about to say, because everything that was about to happen would just be the result of his own actions. The scene goes back to 1 hour earlier, where Ju-won was still outside the path talking with the other players. One of them asked if they really weren't going to enter the other path because the intermediate administrator had blocked the dungeon entrance, so they should try to focus on clearing it in order to leave. But Ju-won replied that they couldn't just keep living such complacent lives. That's why he had decided to simply snap Hyukjin's neck and take Samwa right away. The players confirm that Ju-won just wanted to set up an ambush before finishing them off. He explains that if the player group who went in first took too long, they should just go in and kill them anyway. Since they themselves hadn't started clearing their section of the dungeon yet, they should be much more exhausted than Ju-won's group. Ju-won states that it didn't matter how good Hyukjin thought he was. He was still a nobody who couldn't do anything against real players. Another player mentions that Hyukjin seemed pretty skilled, and asked if maybe it was actually a little too risky to fight him. Ju-won replies that they should have noticed how Hyukjin was somewhat decent in battle. That was when he was fighting and hunting the yaks earlier within the dungeon paths. Even so, his stats weren't much better than theirs. Instead, they should worry far more about Yuhyun. While the group of players would gather around Yuhyun to intercept him, Hyukjin would be left to Ju-won. Also, he could personally tear his neck off with satisfaction. Back to the present, Ju-won was having serious trouble fighting the protagonist, who suddenly demonstrated far more skill than before, making Ju-won wonder what had happened for his fighting style to change so drastically in such a short time. To Ju-won, it was as if his abilities and stats had suddenly improved tremendously. Meanwhile, the other players were also struggling to deal with Yuyan. The players started asking Juwon for help and told him to hurry up and finish his fight. Even though they were trying to attack Yuyan, Sunway intervened using her skill called Platinum Shield to defend him from the attack. That greatly surprised the other players. That girl had enough skill to block such a heavy blow that should have been devastating. While they were still stunned by that ability, Sunwoo created an opening for Yuyan to strike them. He throws a punch to a player's chest, using his power punch skill to attack, sending the player flying and nearly smashing through the dungeon wall with the hit. Another player screams in shock after seeing his teammate get hit that hard, and they decide to try helping Juwon so he could help them fight Yuyan, who was clearly the most dangerous among the enemies inside. One of the players shoots an arrow trying to hit Hyukjin, but the protagonist was able to sense the path of the attack coming his way and dodged it. The archer is shocked to see that, and everyone wonders how Hyukjin was able to block and dodge a strike that came from his blind spot. All of this while he was still busy fighting Juwon. The protagonist was well aware that the attacks from the players who were part of his team were fairly mediocre. His most dangerous one was the guy who always came with surprise attacks, and using that to try to surround the protagonist, the archer and Juwon attack at the same time. Hyukjin thinks that judging by how the other players were supporting Juwon with long-range attacks, they were probably even more annoying to deal with than Juwon himself. The truth was that Yuyan would be the most troublesome. After all, they needed to worry about their own backs before worrying about him, especially since he was clearly stronger in close-quarters combat. Yuyan charges at the archer from behind, asking if they really thought they could demand something from a little girl and try to corner them like that. The archer retreats, clearly afraid of taking a heavy hit. And so those players begin screaming for Juwon to help, who was equally struggling to fight Hyukjin. Juwon is shocked to see his entire plan fall apart. His men were being defeated at an incredible speed. He wonders how things ended up like this when they were supposed to be the victors. After all, Hyukjin hadn't seen that skill before. He had always looked like just a regular level 15 player you could find anywhere, not someone particularly difficult to face. From where he was looking, Hyukjin's stats were clearly much higher than Yuyan's. Realizing he was getting nervous, he tries to calm down and think of something to counterattack. Juwon thinks that Hyukjin may have anticipated his betrayal, but he didn't know anything about his abilities. He was excited to use that to his advantage somehow. Before he could come up with anything, suddenly a liquid is thrown onto his body. It leaves him confused because it seemed like some kind of water. He wonders why, and why the temperature was like that. He didn't know that it was what Hyukjin had been carrying in his thermos bottle all along, and he only gets even more irritated at Hyukjin. The protagonist tells him to take a look around. At that moment, several creatures begin crawling out from the walls. They were none other than giant bees flying directly toward Juwon. The players are all confused by what's happening, until they realize they're honeybees, quickly getting pierced by each one with grotesque wounds. Juwon desperately defends himself from them using his sword. Hyukjin knew that bees were sensitive to sweet smells, and the honey water he brought would be more than enough to draw them all toward Juwon. He had always known that the honeybee attack was an event that could be triggered during the quest of the dungeon's 2 final paths. In contrast to their cute names, the bees were anything but easy to deal with. Their individual levels were actually quite low, but they typically appeared in such massive numbers that treating them carelessly was a mistake. The players were in a panic trying to fight them off, and Hyukjin knew that would happen. If the players didn't have a fire mage in their group, it was best to avoid them altogether instead of causing chaos trying to kill them. So the protagonist shouts for his team to duck to avoid the bees' attacks, because he knew they would lose their targeting ability past a certain height. The agony of being stung by one of those bees was unimaginably painful. Juwon and his players were suffering under the swarm, crying out for help. When it was all over, Hyukjin and his companions stood back up. Those who chose to attack others deserved to meet death as the answer to their cowardice. Hyukjin felt that Juwon had brought that end upon himself and deserved it. Soon the system announces that the situation has been recognized as a player kill, and this was the first player kill situation since the conclusion of the tutorial. He had triggered the awakening of an innate ability on his first player kill. This ability was called an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, an ability that granted the right to return others' actions as revenge. That skill granted him several status boosts, along with the potential to scale even further depending on how long the ability remained active. Hyukjin is surprised by the awakening, finding it strange to have received another one so soon. He had heard about that type of ability before, and it was one that required some form of counterattack to work, but it would only function against players who attacked first. It was common in his original timeline, but worked perfectly in one-on-one combat, to the point that it was practically impossible even for civilians not to know about that technique. However, it was strange because that was an ability considered dormant, which makes him wonder why that was happening, remembering his future in another timeline, where none of this had awakened before. Yuyan approaches, saying it wasn't Hyukjin's fault for what happened, and he shouldn't blame himself since he would have done the same if he had to choose between life and death. Sunwoo agrees because it was really scary, but they were all bad players and he hadn't done anything wrong. Hyukjin realizes they must have been worried that he was blaming himself, so they came closer to comfort him. But the protagonist replies that it was all right and he didn't actually resent it. If they had let people who wanted to kill them stay alive, they would have ended up dying in their place. That's why he didn't regret the decision he made to protect their lives. He'd rather become a murderer than let everyone die, and the system notifies that the Lady of Scales understood his feelings, considering giving him a great gift for his actions, her respect and admiration growing. Hyuk-shin notices his companions were looking at him with much stronger emotions than before, which was a bit awkward, since he wasn't even really concerned about the people who had died to the bees. But thinking about that situation, Hyuk-shin was the only one completely unfazed by it, and realizes he might have changed a lot since then. They return to the crystal, where the protagonist thinks clearing the dungeon was a matter of time. They just needed to destroy 2 more crystals along the upcoming paths. But suddenly, the crystal begins to darken. The system says that the Seoul Station crystal wasn't welcoming intruders, and Hyuk-shin's perception eye detected danger. The players are surprised, but Hyuk-shin tells them to back away. Sunwoo asks what he intends to do, and he replies that he'll deal with it now, and that everything will be fine, assuring them not to worry. Hyuk-shin opens his inventory to grab the honeybee stingers. He had prepared a countermeasure against the poisonous gas coming from the crystal, and that was the use of Minora's gloves, which he had taken beforehand on purpose to resist the poison. The gloves' resistance wasn't strong enough to completely negate the poison, but the system recognized that the gloves were resisting the crystal's venom. Hyuk-shin had to destroy the crystal before the poison spread too much. He noticed that the poisonous smoke was getting even thicker than before, to the point he couldn't even see what lay ahead. The crystal becomes completely hidden, and the system says that the poison had started circulating through Hyuk-shin's body despite his attempts to resist it. The protagonist feels he's reaching the limit of how long he can hold his breath in that space. The other players realize the smoke is getting even worse, and Yu-Yin wonders why Hyuk-shin got so close to the crystal. But soon the protagonist manages to touch the crystal, and the system alerts that the poison is being neutralized. And so the crystal finally dissolves, allowing them to breathe again, having successfully taken care of the trap. Gasping, the protagonist recovers after the impact he had just taken. It was harder than expected, to the point that his hand was marked from the effort. But at least he managed. Seoul Station's crystal was acquired, and he had also completed half the conditions required to finish the dungeon. The nameless observer was intrigued, and the whispering demon appeared disappointed. Hyuk-shin figured that cursed demon really wanted to see him die. Then Yu-Yin asks how he managed to do all that in the middle of the smoke. The protagonist reminds them about the honeybee stingers they collected earlier. He used them to neutralize the poison, which impresses Yu-Yin. He wants to know how Hyuk-shin knew they could be used for that, and Hyuk-shin replies that the item's description mentioned something like it. Yu-Yin is impressed that Hyuk-shin thought of that just from reading the description. In truth, it was the great explorer Jackson who invented that strategy, but he couldn't say that. The other 2 players just stare at the protagonist with visible admiration. Then Hyuk-shin says they should leave now that they're done here. They took care of one part, so the next should be a little easier than before. Sinya just watched him walk away, heading toward another crystal. He hadn't used the bee honey from the attack event just to get rid of Ju-won, but collected the items knowing they had a neutralizing effect. Anonymous guardians entered the channel in large numbers to watch the match, but the administrator thought that the strategy was so clean that it didn't even need to be explained on stream. The real master of the Demon Mountain also joined the channel to watch. Just as Hyuk-shin acquired the other crystal from Seoul Station, fulfilling the conditions to close the dungeon, it was completed. The dungeon break and the Seoul Station dungeon were successfully sealed. At that moment, Sinya approaches to immediately offer the rewards. That catches the protagonist by surprise. It must be special if she's doing it personally. She agrees, saying that a bonus status point would be distributed to all party members, all in accordance with those who completed the Seoul Station dungeon, and player Hyuk-shin would receive the opportunity to choose items for his incredible play. Being the first one to clear it, he's allowed to pick some of those rewards. It was quite useful. The nameless observer was especially curious to see what his choice would be. The most meaningful reward now would be something with long-term utility. There were 3 options: Gold, Recovery Elixir Type A, and Recovery Elixir Type B. Hyuk-shin thinks that gold is definitely a good option, but that doesn't mean he can turn it into cash. But if it were 3.75 in gold, it would be around 200 million won. That number was doubly significant because it foreshadowed a future dungeon. There were many reasons why an average person would choose gold without hesitation. Even for the protagonist, it was quite tempting since he always dreamed of making more money. But the rights of players weren't protected by law during the early stages, so they still had to give up a portion of everything they received as if it were tax. He could remember the gold, in particular, being confiscated under the argument that otherworldly goods were dangerous. It was very unfair, but these were the kinds of things they'd have to deal with from now on. It would be lucky not to lose everything to the government when turning gold into money. In that case, Hyuk-shin decides to skip the opportunity to use it under these circumstances, and instead chooses the Recovery Elixir Type B, as it was the safer option. The nameless observer becomes curious about the choice, and the Lady of Scales is unsure. The Whispering Demon ends up being impressed by the decision he made. But at last, the dungeon break at Seoul Station was sealed. The group exited after safely clearing the dungeon. Later, the protagonist tried to talk to his sister about something. She was surprised by the question about possibly moving away, not understanding if he had gotten rich or something to be acting like that. Hyukjin agrees, saying he had saved up a little, around 100 million. She asks if he was drunk or something, but the protagonist doesn't blame her for doubting him. 100 million was a lot of money by their living standards, more than their family had ever had. The recovery elixir type B he chose was highly effective against a specific illness. As planned, he gave the elixir to a certain person, just like Ju-won had done in his original timeline. He remembered that this person had the finances to pay a high amount for it, and also suffered from the illness the elixir was made to cure from the beginning. That was the buyer Ju-won had approached, and in exchange he received about 1 billion won, or around $1 million. The protagonist thought things might work out. After all, if it went the same as in the original timeline, the deal he was aiming for would be a huge success. Not only that, but it also connected him with a highly influential person because of it. While thinking about this, the protagonist noticed his sister distracted on her phone. She was looking at the news and CEO Sung Shin suddenly appeared. Hyukjin recognized the man as CEO Song Kyung, who had lost all his hair. His sister was curious since he should have been wearing a wig by now. Craftsmen were really good. It even looked like real hair. Hyukjin wanted to say it was real hair. He knew that because he had seen Song's hair grow back after taking the elixir. Recovery elixir type B had also been called an effective hair growth solution. It was known as a recovery elixir, but in reality it was an item that treated baldness. But the man who had built that corporation with his own hands and nurtured it into what it was today saw it as an investment opportunity. Song looked at Hyukjin and accepted the deal for 100,000 in cash and an apartment. He also agreed to help with the procedures to adopt Sunhwa. After all, she was a girl whose future had been uncertain ever since her dungeon tutorial. His mother praised the girl as cheerful and lively and wanted her to live with them. So Hyukjin figured Sunhwa wouldn't be shaken by the news, and so he announced to his sister that they would be moving, yet really bought a house. It was time for their family to live somewhere better and work less. His sister just sighed, not paying attention to his words. Hyukjin smiled. The whole family would be going home early that day. When he got back, they could go out to eat with their mom, but he was interrupted. That was because a portal suddenly appeared in the middle of the street among all the people around. It hadn't been long since the Seoul Station dungeon opened, and suddenly this happened. Out of nowhere, the person who appeared outside was a girl he recognized, Shin Yanseo. At that moment, the bus came to a sudden stop, alerting that something urgent was happening. The protagonist got ready to get off and told his sister, which confused her since it was far to walk. There was only one portal and appeared in the Hongjudan area at that moment. Publicly known as the first dungeon the Empress of the Sword had cleared. Besides that, not much was known about what happened there. It didn't become a historic achievement because of its nature as a light portal, or because it was a special dungeon. Instead, it was because the Empress of the Sword, Shin Yanseo, had emerged. She became famous because she was the first player where the strongest PvP fighter ever appeared. Hyukjin approaches and asks Shin if she intended to enter the dungeon. The girl was surprised and turned around, asking if he could actually see the portal. He says yes because he was also a player, meaning they were on equal footing. He couldn't see a trace of the Empress of the Sword he had known in 2028. The cute and lively air around Shin was completely different from the two-faced killer she would become. Shin smiled when she heard he was a player and asked if he knew about those things. Hyukjin was able to see her status window. She was level 19 and had skills. The protagonist was always surprised because those summaries of people were kind of bizarre. They even said she was pure, like a two-faced girl in love. Hyukjin says that was a portal and monsters would come out of it if it wasn't cleared in time. She's surprised because the intermediate administrator had mentioned something like that earlier, and he confirms that hadn't happened yet because all dungeons so far had been cleared. But even the players who cleared dungeons accepted the existence of dungeon breaks, so most likely the things that were said were actually true. Shin realizes it was just like that guy with the title tutorial finisher. There still hadn't been any dungeon breaks in this timeline. That was because Hyukjin had been using his knowledge to end them quickly. In his original timeline, the Seoul Station dungeon experienced several breaks. Many players died before a strategy was discovered to clear the dungeon. This time, he had prevented that from happening and saved those people from being lost. Eventually, there would be so many dungeons and portals appearing that he wouldn't be able to handle them all. Dungeon breaks would end up happening anyway, even unintentionally. Then Hyukjin asked again if she planned to enter the portal, but Shin gets nervous, unsure if it would really be okay. She was a less suitable person. It would be different if it were the tutorial finisher, unlike someone like her. Hyukjin replies that it was fine. Eventually, the tutorial finisher was surpassed by her in PvP. Then he asks if she'd like to form a party with him, which catches her by surprise. He says he's level 19, and Shin smiles when she sees they're at the same point. She thought she had been leveling up quickly, but she's relieved that wasn't the case. Actually, she wanted to try something else before going in, and so she sends a party invite. Hyukjin accepts, and then she asks how old he was, which confuses him. When he replies he's 20 years old, Shin is surprised. She thought he was older. In truth, he was 30 mentally, but his body was still 20. She felt they were different in age because he spoke very formally. So she suggested they speak more casually since they were the same age. Hyukshin says they keep it that way. If they make it out alive, they definitely survive. The two then enter the portal of light. He never thought he'd encounter this on his way back to Sungshin, but this was the golden opportunity for the protagonist to make good use of it. He could see what it was like inside the portal that the Empress of the Sword had cleared alone after the tutorial. The protagonist was the first to enter, leaving Shin frozen as she watched him disappear. Hyukshin was curious to see the underground tunnel and figured he should take a look. The return portal was still active. It didn't seem to be designed to prevent escape. If the Empress of the Sword was able to clear it alone after the tutorial, it shouldn't be that difficult. Suddenly, the system alerted that monsters were appearing, catching him off guard. Rabbit-type monsters between levels 20 and 18 emerged, making him curious. Shin, who arrived shortly after, was impressed because they were large monsters. She asked if they were some sort of boss types, even though they didn't look that strong. The protagonist had to agree they weren't strong monsters despite their height. Unlike players, he could tell how strong a monster was just from its appearance. They were rabbits, so they didn't seem threatening or powerful like other monsters. Their main trait was that they fled quickly when they judged a target as a threat. That's exactly what happened. Hyukshin knew they ran because they feared them. If possible, they had to kill each one in a single blow, and he asked if she could do it. Shin smiled in agreement. She had the perfect skill to make that work. It was expected. She had the title of one-hit finisher, always being the Sword Empress even if it was still a bit early. She charged at the monsters with her sword and defeated them without any problem. That was the innate ability of the Sword Empress, the one-hit finisher. It was impressive on its own, but he didn't expect her to be this skilled this early. Her behavior also changed the moment she started fighting. She looked like an ordinary college student just a short while ago. Now she perfectly matched the battle-obsessed woman he remembered. Setting that aside, he never would have guessed this portal was filled with rabbit monsters. They were practically invincible against people with poor attack speed, but their attack and defense power was weak, even though they were particularly well known. Still, among other players, there was another reason for their interest. With a bit of luck, he was able to get that thing there, though nothing dropped this time. Shin asked if he'd been here before, and he denied it. It was his first time. She thought that because he was killing the rabbits with such ease and speed, to which he replied that she also only needed one strike for each of them. Even so, Shin sighed and let it go. There was no need to argue. Now that she knew they were in the same age, trying to talk normally was kind of driving her crazy. She just wanted to speak casually, and Hyukshin finally introduced himself to her. Shin was about to call him by name and introduced herself too, but there was something she wanted to ask. She was wondering if he had a lot of knowledge about portals, but she was sure of it after watching him kill that rabbit, even if she didn't understand how he knew so much. Hyukshin remembered spending hours studying portals that appeared at specific times. His last exam covered association policies and how frequently portals occurred. He simply answered that he tends to learn everything he studies somehow. She still smiled, saying it was hard to believe something like that. The Whispering Demon was impressed by the protagonist's answer. Even more monsters appeared, and Hyukshin said they should talk after dealing with them. Among the items dropped by the rabbit monsters, some stood out. There was something that could greatly help players between levels 30 and 40. Hyukshin hadn't expected it to drop after just killing 1 or 2 rabbits. But since it was there, he made a point to get one before leaving. He would hunt until it appeared. Senya was just watching when she heard a voice praising the player, saying he really was interesting. A girl named Ro asked if Senya was the one broadcasting him to the Guardians. Ro was curious because the player had reached level 19. Not many players should be able to keep up with Shin. They could try to view his current status, but access was denied. Senya explained that wouldn't be possible. Hyukshin had modified access to his professional information. He even removed his player name from the ranking board. Ro was surprised, wondering how he suddenly knew about access permissions. Normally, players weren't told about that kind of thing, and she asked if Senya had told him. She replied that obviously she hadn't. She hadn't done anything against the commandments. There was nothing to worry about, but Rose still thought the whole thing was strange. She could see a player using the system, but doing something this blatant, he seemed like the kind of man who took advantage of easy targets. In any case, broadcasting Hyukshin should be a good source of income. Ro wanted to know if she could take on the job when Senya wasn't available. Once again, Senya replied that none of that would be possible. She had signed an exclusive contract with the protagonist, which really surprised Ro. That kind of thing could only be done 3 times, but still she had stepped forward and acted. There was nothing Ro could do if he turned out to be the early rising type. But none of that had anything to do with Ro to begin with, and it never would. While the players kept fighting, Hyukshin suddenly saw an item drop. It was an iron sword of high quality forged by a high-level blacksmith. It had excellent attack power and durability, which caught his attention. He threw the sword to Shin, telling her to use it since it was better than her current one. She caught the sword in surprise, unsure if it was really okay for her to take it. Hyukshin knew she'd make better use of swords than he ever could, so she accepted the sword, thanking him for the offer because she knew it was truly good. In exchange, she said she'd offer him the next item that dropped, no matter what it was. The truth was, the protagonist wasn't really looking for a weapon. He had a lot of knowledge about the monsters that would appear over the next 10 years. The weapons he had now were already quite good. He didn't need the iron sword. He wondered how many more monsters he'd have to take care of before it showed up. It needed to appear before the monster spawn limit was reached. Another item dropped, and Hyuchin quickly grabbed it because he had finally found it. This was probably the best result he could get within that portal. The Ring of Legolas, a ring crafted by refining topaz that held a mysterious power. There was an HP absorption ring, and just then, he glanced to the side and saw a large crystal. The completion crystal was already appearing even though they'd barely entered the dungeon. It seemed it was designed to show up after a certain number of monsters had been killed. Few dungeons were this easy. It made sense she had completed it alone in her timeline. Shin asked if there was something there. He replied it wasn't anything important. They should focus on defeating all the rabbit monsters first. He had obtained the ring, but that wasn't enough. Rings were the only equipment that could stack. He still had 9 other fingers, so he couldn't stop there. It might take a few hours, but it didn't matter. He needed to collect them all. Shin noticed that the protagonist was dealing with the monsters at the same speed she was. With all the knowledge he had, it felt like he'd entered the portal before she had. It made her wonder just who exactly that strange player was. After some time, Shin realized that the monsters stopped appearing after a while. She had thought they earned some points by killing rabbits, so they had been there for hours. But now she wondered how they were supposed to leave, and Hyuchin pointed out where they needed to go. It was so dark she could barely see anything, not even the direction of the exit. The protagonist had seen the completion crystal when it was forcibly destroyed. The light portal with the underground tunnel had been successfully completed. That was more than enough. Unlike dungeons, portals couldn't be entered again once they were closed. But he had managed to collect 8 HP absorption rings. He'd made the right call farming until the monster limit. Meanwhile, Senya was trembling with frustration because the brats were causing trouble. The brave Lion King was bored. The nameless observer had stopped watching. The Lady of Scales found the players' actions quite strange. Hyuchin knew watching them hunt for hours was really boring, but he couldn't believe they were acting like this even knowing how important that item was. It really took longer than he expected, especially after saying he'd just walk home. But now he also needed to think about what he'd tell his sister when he got out of the portal. The two of them exited the dungeon, and Shin noticed it was the same place as before they entered. But something felt different. There were no more people around. Something was off. That's when Ro approached, thanking the Guardians for visiting her channel. The true master of the Celestial Demonic Mountain had just requested the creation of a PvP zone. As such, from that moment on, she announced it through the establishment of a PvP zone. Hyuchin knew Ro, the administrator in charge of broadcasting Shin. She was an intermediate administrator like Senya, but a different kind of fairy. Ro said those two players had drawn a lot of attention from the Guardians. On one side was the sword genius who had caught the eye of the true master of the Celestial Demonic Mountain. On the other was an unknown player with an enormous amount of knowledge. She wondered who would come out victorious in such a grand battle. Since it was a PvP zone, they wouldn't die and all damage received would be ignored. Guardians were free to vote on which player they thought would win. Ro was skilled at handling the Guardians who were watching. That was one of the reasons she became one of the most well-known intermediate administrators. She was the complete opposite of someone lacking communication skills. That person was Senya, who simply stayed quiet and broadcasted Hyuchin without trying to hype anyone up. Shin didn't understand why things ended up turning out that way, but she wanted to know if it was really true that they couldn't die. Even in the worst-case scenario, it was impossible to die in a PvP zone. Just as she'd heard, any wound would be healed once the PvP ended. Honestly, Hyuchin was shocked. He didn't think he'd witness this so soon, especially when he didn't even have a guardian by his side to handle everything. Some guardians expressed surprise at his observation. The Lady of the Scales, the Whispering Demon, and the Brave Lion King were all stunned. Even the nameless observer was silent upon hearing that. That comment made Ro wonder if she wasn't allowed to know about guardian selection, and she questioned whether Senya had really said nothing to Hyuchin from the beginning. Not that it was any of her business to worry about in the first place. Without further delay, Ro decided to begin the PvP once and for all, and asked the Guardians to cheer for the victory of her player. But Hyuchin asked her to wait because he had something to say before they started. The Guardian Ro mentioned, the one who requested the PvP, had something to say to the true master of the Celestial Demonic Mountain. He asked if this noble Guardian wasn't someone who promoted betrayal, seeing as he was unjustly asking Hyuchin to betray someone who had trusted him in battle. Just as his name implied, true master of the Celestial Demonic Mountain. That was the result. He openly declared his identity as the lord of millions of followers, the one who stands atop the demonic mountain. In his original timeline, he was as famous as Shin's guardian. As for his nature, he caused wars on the same scale as the brave lion. His belligerence marked him clearly as a true warrior. So don't misunderstand, it wasn't about courage. He was a warrior who despised betrayal of trust and stood against injustice and cowardice. Moreover, he was extremely proud, so he was bound to respond. The true master of the Celestial Demonic Mountain granted a temporary skill, and Hyuchin received the one-hit finisher skill, usable only in the PvP zone. Just as expected, and Shin was surprised this actually happened. From the proud warrior's perspective, Shin, who had received the skill long before him, was the strongest. In fact, Hyuchin didn't know if he could win just because he'd received the skill. In that Guardian's eyes, Hyuchin was just a weakling who didn't have the one-hit finisher. And as a proud warrior, he would believe that a fighter he hadn't trained personally was the weakest. Hyukjin agreed with that, but only for a moment because now he also had the skill. He thought it was ironic they had to battle right after clearing a dungeon together. Now that he had this ability, he was genuinely curious to see who would win. Actually, Shin felt exactly the same. She was curious to see who would come out on top. After all, Hyukjin had offered her that sword just a few hours ago, saying it would be better if she used it. But from what she could see, he was truly extraordinary. After all, the protagonist had been hunting those rabbit monsters at the same speed as she had. And that wasn't all. He knew a lot about what was inside the portal. And he also knew how to get out as if he could see in the dark without concern. For some reason, Hyukjin just knew everything, or maybe he could simply see it somehow. Either way, she wondered how he would fight her if he used his full willpower. They both had the same skill, and she suggested they could just duel right away. He agreed, thinking Shin had truly found the right guardian. If she was that curious, she could see for herself, and he prepared for the fight. The brave Lion King urged them to start already, while the true master of the celestial demonic mountain silently watched the duel. The two rushed at each other and clashed swords at the exact same moment. That was when Hyukjin's Eye of Perception activated instantly. The two exchanged sword strikes, and the protagonist managed to defend himself. That was because his Eye of Perception let him know exactly what she would do next. Although sometimes it seemed like she'd make a move, she could also fake it to trick him. Even Ro was surprised by how well Hyukjin adapted to her battle style. They were witnessing a high-level PvP match thanks to the kind of skills now available. But even though he could anticipate her moves, it still wasn't enough. He couldn't find any way to counterattack. When it came to swordsmanship, he had few techniques. In that case, there was only one thing to do, and they continued trading blows. After all, Hyukjin knew that she still hadn't learned to handle a sword carefully. Shin asked if he simply had good perception, but said she'd take it seriously either way. That surprised him since until now she hadn't been doing that. Shin said she had been holding back a little, so even if they wouldn't die, getting hit would still hurt, and she knew that very well. Hyukjin was impressed as it seemed Shin had understood the limits of her own skill. To her, it must have felt like their abilities were at similar levels. What mattered now wasn't that, but her timing with the one-hit finisher. So even if he suffered some cuts, the protagonist wasn't going to stop. When Shin least expected it, her sword attack struck a tree instead of her opponent. She wondered if Hyukjin was also holding back his speed. Using the temporary one-hit finisher skill, the protagonist moved again. He attacked her from behind just in time, merely pressing his sword against her neck. With that, he would have been declared the winner since he landed the pressure. And she admitted defeat, granting Hyukjin the win for the first PvP zone. That caught the protagonist by surprise. PvP zones usually appeared much later than this. The title of first opponent began to generate, awarded to the winner of the first PvP battle. The opponent gains a considerable advantage in elevated terrain over other players. It granted him Light Step, a skill that lets you leap forward before your opponent can react. A formidable light-based technique that didn't require any mana to use. There have been many speculations about how the Empress of the Sword obtained Light Step, but the truth was that she had won a PvP battle in Hyukjin's original timeline. Shin asked what exactly he had been thinking about so much. He had won, so he should be happy with his reward. Either way, she was so shocked she called her mother for the first time since elementary school. If Han saw her now, she'd probably be just as surprised. In a way, it felt like stealing the Empress of the Sword's skill. But it wasn't intentional, and Hyukjin had won, so he didn't have anything to worry about. Besides, it seemed like they were shocked that he had actually won, and the Guardians talked about it. It was as if all four Guardians were watching with vivid interest. They were probably trying to make a good impression because they knew about the selection. The brave Lion King kept mocking his dirty tricks, as expected. That guy still firmly hated Hyukjin, despite everything. But for some reason, he kept watching his channel even while hating him that much. The PvP zone was deactivated, finally ending after a long moment. The wound he got during the battle was healed, just as they had been promised. At that, Shin reminded him they weren't going to go their separate ways just because of this. She wanted his member so she could give him hers too, which left him confused. In truth, Shin thought they might team up again later. Not to drink or anything like that, but to work together in the game. And after everything, she had ended up liking the kind of person Hyukjin was. She was really straightforward, so he couldn't do anything but accept it. The protagonist added his number right when his Eye of Perception detected danger. He couldn't dodge it. Maybe he should just accept it, so he took the hit to the back. There was an attack from his sister, who suddenly appeared, angry because he had left without saying anything, just disappearing all of a sudden when she had been looking for him for hours. She even thought he had died. Shin asked who she was, and Hyukjin said she was his sister. Back home, the protagonist sighed, thinking they would have been moving out soon. It would take 3 days to pack everything. His family could finally live a better life. They didn't seem to believe it even after he showed them the house papers. It was just a matter of time, but one thing was certain. The future of his family would improve. The rest of the future he remembered was unfolding almost the same as before. In the old timeline, the cataclysm began worldwide on May 11th, 2018. More than 20 million people died around the world in the tutorial fields. The internet could only talk about the looming global crisis in society. On one side, the global conglomerate Sungshin labeled all items and goods related to the game as new technology, and they announced they would put maximum effort into new businesses related to it. So far, everything matched Hyukjin's notes. if things continue to follow a predetermined future. So that meant that on June 16th, just 3 days from now, dungeons and portals would appear all across the country. He could know the future, but he couldn't solve all the problems that would come. And he wasn't a hero, much less a true saint. If there was one thing a mere player like him could do, it was simply to play every single day. On June 16th, the Yuwang murder would take place and 6 people would die along the mountain route. Even so, the one who killed them was unknown, but Kyuchin knew what he had to do that day. He went to the mountains with Manhwa, saying they were out hunting some monsters. They should be around here. Slimes were too weak to be considered actual monsters. Manhwa asked if there was anything else interesting or different around, and he agreed, saying there was a lycanthrope, which made her tremble. Meanwhile, even more rumors were spreading about events like the one in Jano happening all over the world. It was so terrifying that people didn't even want to think about it. They didn't even know what was going on. They heard that those monsters classified as intermediate administrators were killing people, whether for good or bad. But unfortunately, no one could do anything about things like that. Bullets didn't work on those administrators, and soon they also ran into another monster. Apparently, those squishy things didn't seem dangerous. They thought they could catch the slimes and sell them. But they decided to give up on it. If it were really that easy, Sungshin wouldn't be paying other players like them, or whatever they were being called. This new technology had a reason for being priced so high. Even after living for 50 years, it was the first time they'd seen the world change so drastically. On the way, someone saw something that had just passed right over them. But the others didn't see anything, which scared the women. It could be a monster. It was Hyuchin who appeared, encountering the 3 50-year-old women. They were halfway up the mountain. They had to be the victims of the incident. That's when one of the women froze as she reached for her phone, frightened by Hyuchin. He asked them to stay still, because it would be dangerous if they started screaming. Any noise could provoke it, so they had to calm down a bit. But 2 of them screamed anyway, calling for the police. They wanted to run away right now. That's when the level 24 lycanthrope appeared in response to the screams. The 2 women who screamed ran off without even knowing what it was. As the 2 ran, the one left behind fell to the ground in fear. But Kyuchin stepped in front of her to protect her. He had followed the bloodlust ever since entering the mountain. As expected, he managed to find that monster after some persistence. This would be the first time he fought it without using tricks. But the bloodlust was coming from more than one source. It seemed like something even more sophisticated than the lycanthrope was lurking around. While worrying about finding it, he turned just in time to face an attack from behind. The protagonist dodged the strike, ready to kill it immediately. The first opponent title was taking effect, and he used his light steps ability. Hyuchin approached the enemy while the system asked if he wanted to change the first opponent title to excellent player. Using the excellent player title, he increased his damage and speed. Then, using the excellent strike skill, Hyuchin attacked the other monster. That creature was a level 27 six-tailed fox. It caught him by surprise. It was strange for a 6-tailed fox to show up now. 6-tailed foxes were difficult monsters that fell under the spirit-type category. Skilled in stealth and ambushes, these tricky enemies could use a bit of spiritual magic. It wasn't that he didn't know what kind of monster it was, but he wondered why it was here. However, one of the women ended up seriously injured because of it. While the lycanthrope remained ready to attack her again, Manhwa came to the rescue. Using her taunt skill, she drew its attention to herself. This wasn't Manhwa's first time facing a monster. Last time, Hyuchin had handled everything alone. So this time, she tried to think about what she could do if she were in his place. The lycanthrope's howl caused physical effects, and Manhwa remembered suffering from it last time. Her whole body was shaking so much she couldn't do anything. But now it was different. The status anomaly didn't affect her at all. This time, she would be the one to hunt it, and she wouldn't give in to its attacks. She defended herself using the Platinum Darkness skill, but it was fine. Manhwa would endure until the end. After all, Hyuchin knew how to handle its attacks, so she had to as well. What he had to do now was hold on to that guy until the end. So Manhwa wasn't going to let go anytime soon to keep him from attacking the civilian again. That's when Hyuchin appeared to attack the lycanthrope and save Manhwa's life. Then the girl finished it by landing a massive punch on him, sending him flying away. And just like that, the lycanthrope was successfully defeated, granting experience and coins. The predator of the tutorial field, Hidden Peace, and the King of Wolves, that was the lycanthrope. It was easier to kill him than expected at first. If it hadn't been for the 6-tailed fox, the job would have been done already. That's when the 2 other women on the ground backed away in fear, calling it a monster. It looked like there had been a casualty because of the unexpected appearance of a 6-tailed fox. Unfortunately, one of the women ended up in an irreversible state. Hyuchin intended to let her rest in peace and remembered the murder case on Mount Enwang. What the government had announced in the past was that they'd successfully taken care of the lycanthrope, but they had failed to find the real predator, the 6-tailed fox. And so they failed to take its life during the entire mountain incident. A spirit-type monster was hard to kill with the current level of technology, so they announced the success to the public prematurely. The 6-tailed fox was a cunning and sleight type skilled at fleeing, but it was injured, so it shouldn't have escaped far. Meanwhile, the women were still looking at the fox and screaming for help. Hyuchin decided to approach since he knew it wasn't too far away. It needed to eat human flesh to regenerate the wound it had received, especially the entrails of its targets, which were its main focus. Before the fox could attack the human, Hyukjin stepped in front to save her. That must be why it attacked the fleeing woman instead of focusing on the players. It was obvious from the wounds on its stomach that it was trying to get to the organs, but it didn't have enough time to do something like that. Or at least that was probably what it wanted them to think. What stood in front of them now was a doppelganger it had created. If it had been the real body, it would have eaten quickly. At this point, the protagonist wanted to know where the real body was. When he used his detection ability, he saw the body at the top of a tree at the 11 o'clock position. It was hiding with camouflage and looking in their direction. It shouldn't have had any idea that he knew its location thanks to the eye of perception. If it had noticed, it would have relocated to another blind spot to hide again. To catch its real body, he needed to act like he didn't know. So Hyukjin told Sunhwa to immediately provoke their opponent. But even with her using her skill, it seemed like the fox wasn't fully provoked. Hyukjin said it was fine. They could continue just like that. He wouldn't stop until they had fully captured its attention once they were done. He would bring it down, so she just needed to trust him and keep provoking it. So Sunhwa did that and insisted on using her skill to provoke the target. The fox finally lunged at her. This clone wasn't an illusion. It was a physical duplicate of the real body, which meant their stats were split between the two. The awakened clone of the six-tailed fox couldn't break through Sunhwa's defense. If killing that clone would end things now, he would have done it immediately. But it would be useless, because the real body could sense the danger and flee. Then the system suggested buying the starter dagger for 260 coins. That was the only solution. He had to go after his opponent. He kept his eyes on the real body of the six-tailed fox and attacked it directly with a thrown dagger. The brave Lion King showed interest in Hyukjin's throwing skill. The nameless observer got fixated on him, and the true master of the celestial demonic mountain mocked him. At that moment, Sunhwa froze in surprise when the six-tailed fox disappeared. That was because he had thrown the dagger and hit the real body dead on. She turned around, unsure if he had done something to deal with the fox. In truth, she thought she heard the sound of an arrow being fired just before. Hyukjin approached the real body of the fox and finished it off with his own sword, gaining even more experience and coins from the successful hunt. The brave Lion King was very pleased with his dagger-throwing skill. The true master of the celestial demonic mountain was stunned. At last, he acquired the item known as the foxtail. He thought he might have a chance, considering it was a six-tailed fox. But that item really did appear. He should make good use of it in the dungeon that would soon show up. He received congratulations because his level had increased, reaching level 26. When Hyukjin turned around, he heard the sound of what seemed like a helicopter approaching. Someone had probably called the police. Getting involved without a good reason would bring too many variables. It was better to leave right away, but before that, Senya approached. She asked what his level was. Hyukjin felt she'd gotten used to showing up like this out of nowhere, so he simply told her to scan him, and she saw that he was level 26. Even so, he noticed Senya's wings were trembling. It meant she was agitated. Suddenly, a pause occurred thanks to Senya's powers taking effect. The Lady of the Scales granted Hyukjin a pause, and messages from other guardians began pouring in. She asked him to review their offers. The alerts kept arriving non-stop through the system. The brave Lion King evaluated him and became more friendly toward him, showing great interest in his hidden courage and spirit. He wanted to gift him a tier 3 elixir of great strength. First, the messages from the brave Lion King made Hyukjin wonder why that idiot liked him. Then the Lady of the Scales and the Whispering Demon spoke up. Those two guardians with completely different natures ended up offering other things. The starting equipment of Jo Sunghyun, the Typhoon, a rare grade weapon. It was something rarely obtainable in the early days of the game, the Sword of Aten, and a consumable that boosted player growth in exchange for shifting their alignment to evil. That was the demonic fruit. Either item could turn any player into a ranker. If he picked up those items now, that's exactly what would happen. Lastly, there was the tempting offer from the true master of the celestial demonic mountain. Hyukjin hadn't expected he'd offer to pass down the celestial demonic art. His gift idea was insane. In the end, there was nothing from the nameless observer. He was just contemplating Hyukjin's concentration and posture, watching him the entire time. Aside from watching since the tutorial, he hadn't made a single move. But for now, the other guardians had made significant offers. And of course, there was only one explanation for the situation. They were all pressuring him to choose them when he reached level 30. They wanted to show they could give gifts like these and had the authority to pause time. That was why Senya had been trembling like that earlier. She had probably wanted to tell him that it was time for the first advancement upon reaching level 25. Despite everything, she knew very well that the guardians would make their moves. Once they realized the player they had their eyes on was about to hit level 30, this was the result. Senya was probably getting flooded with complaints right now. They wanted to know why she hadn't announced it earlier and so many other things. They wouldn't even let her off the hook if she used the commandments prohibiting interference with a player's game as an excuse. Even if Senya had something to say, the poor girl wouldn't be able to form a sentence. So Hyukjin walked up since he had a general idea of what was going on. She was in a tight spot because of the announcement she made earlier. But Senya responded that she had no idea what he was talking about. Hyukjin shot back that she knew exactly what he meant. She hadn't have seen the offers he received. She hadn't done her job properly, especially if she managed to piss off all the guardians at once. Senya was getting irritated. demanding to know who exactly he was and what he wanted. He replied that it would be 3,000 coins. Senya argued that it could be 2,000. Hyukshin questioned whether she was really in any position to negotiate with him like that. He'd heard guardians were temperamental. If she could handle it on her own, then go ahead. She then suggested 2,700 coins instead, and Hyukshin replied that she should know they were in the same boat, so he asked for 3,000. If she was rejecting it because of a problem with the price he chose, that was fine. He'd be happy to name the price that would make them complete strangers again, right here and now. In the end, Senya gave in to the 3,000 coins after hearing him talk, but said she couldn't ask for more than that. With that, the pause ended and Hyukshin asked for the contract because he was ready to sign it. Later, the protagonist and Sunwoo returned home when he got a phone call. It was Shin calling suddenly because she'd read the article where Hyukshin was mentioned. She wanted to know if it was really him who had killed the monster on Mount Enwang, and she thanked him. After all, otherwise her mother would have died that day. It was all thanks to him, and she'd never forget anything he did. She even offered to do anything he wanted. She would take care of him however he wished. Hyukshin couldn't understand where she got those ideas from all of a sudden, but he had planned to call Shin anyway because he wanted to ask her something. He had to go somewhere for a few days and wanted to ask if she wanted to come with him. Shin grew curious about what kind of trip it was, and he simply said it was far away. Hyukshin told Shin, Sunwoo, and Union that he wanted them to accompany him on a trip to Japan the very next day. Actually, not a trip, but a raid that was going to take place. He was asking them to join him to clear a portal in Osaka. Shin asked if he meant the same kind of portal as before, the one where they hunted for about 5 hours. Hyukshin agreed, but there was no way to tell if it would be the same. They needed to enter the portal to find out what would happen inside. What they knew now was that all portals had a chance of breaking. Some countries had prepared for the tutorial, and the portals had learned of Korea's disaster. But no matter how well one prepared, the sudden appearance of dungeons or portals could cause the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. The portal Hyukshin wanted to see would open soon, and he wasn't even sure he could finish it. Once it broke, monsters would come out of the portal and attack people. There would be hundreds of casualties, including the awakened involved. If the right team was there at the right time and place, they could reduce the damage like in the Mount Enwang incident the day before. It was just a proposal, and they could refuse if they didn't want to go. They weren't going on a relaxing trip, so he couldn't ask them to join casually. But if they went, he would cover all the costs, including plane tickets and every other travel expense. All they had to bring were clothes and their passports to the airport the next day. Shin sighed, unable to believe he called her because of work. She figured she should have expected it when he suddenly invited her on a trip. As Hyukshin said, it was for a raid, not a trip. He never even said the word trip before. Then Shin asked him to just say how he knew those things were going to happen. The protagonist answered that he had a prophetic dream and could foresee important events in the game through his dreams. He never told them before because he thought it was the best thing to do under the circumstances. Anything was possible, and he confirmed that after Shin reacted in disbelief. Whether it was portals or monsters appearing, senseless things would happen in this world. There was no rule that said premonitions couldn't exist too. But it would all depend on whether they chose to believe him. Whether they trusted him or not, Hyukshin was sure of what he saw and was going to Japan even if he had to go alone. Shin understood that he was really determined to go that far. She was about to fail her classes if she kept skipping, but it didn't matter. She decided to think of it as a date and said she would go with him. As for Yubian, he followed Hyukshin anywhere he was invited. He owed him for saving his life and wouldn't abandon him when it mattered. Sunwoo asked what would happen with her, and Hyukshin said he'd take care of her travel arrangements, but if she didn't want to go, she just had to say so. But she said she wanted to travel since she had never flown on a plane before. Honestly, he thought at least one of the three would end up refusing. It was unexpected. With that group, he didn't have to worry about lack of power or anything like that. The future King of the Fist, the Empress of the Sword, and an even more talented tank all together. This was the best group Hyukshin could have as a beginner in the dungeons. And so it was settled. They would leave for Osaka the next day. It didn't take long for the group to board the plane while preparing for the flight. Sunwoo was excited because it could really fly, and Shin smiled and agreed. If she didn't fasten her seatbelt quickly, she'd be thrown backward. While the two chatted, the protagonist thought they might actually arrive safely. But there was another problem. He didn't know exactly when the portal would open. All Hyukshin knew was that sometime before the portal broke, a tutorial with a 33% survival rate would take place. This was known as the Tokyo Tutorial, an initial portal that normally only had weak monsters. Sometimes, strangely strong ones appeared, but only in special cases. Considering that a portal break happened in Japan right afterward, it was complicated. Maybe it was hard to complete the dungeon because it appeared too close to the tutorial. Or maybe the special case really did occur. Hyukshin wouldn't know which of the two it was until he saw the portal in person. All he could do was travel to Osaka as quickly as possible, and so he would stay in Japan for a week. Someone knew it was a bit late to ask, but she wondered if it was okay to be away for so long. He replied that she should have seen how happy everyone was about moving into the new house. Even Hyukshin's sister wanted to know what he had been doing to manage all of that. His sister's obvious suspicion made the protagonist sigh, but he was used to it. She acted like she wasn't happy, but in truth, they all were. It would be great if that were the whole truth, but for now, Sunwo wanted to believe him. Then the plane finally prepared for takeoff, confirming the passengers were ready. The group arrived in Dotonbori, Japan, the main street of Osaka, where the portal would appear. Originally, the portal wasn't supposed to be cleared successfully. It would break and many monsters would appear. If possible, Hyukshin wanted to locate the portal the moment it showed up. But even if they failed to find it, they would kill the monsters that emerged. Even if they came pouring out, they would minimize the damage as quickly as possible. He was eager to take care of it, but there was no way to know how long it would take. That's when a portal appeared in front of Hyukshin, and he froze in shock. But it was just Sinya appearing, nearly giving him a heart attack. Sinya began by stating that they were the only ones who could see her right now. If they wanted to avoid any discomfort, they could stay silent and let Hyukshin do the talking. She asked why he had come to Japan, and the protagonist answered it was for vacation. The makeup of his group made her doubt that it was really just that. She could only assume he had another goal in mind, and he asked if she meant something related to the game was going to happen. Sinya replied that according to the commandments, she was forbidden from interfering with the game, even more so from leaking information to players, so she wouldn't answer that question. But she understood that discussing a Guardian's mission proposal was different. There was only one moment like this, and many Guardians were offering missions, and among them, one sponsor who wished to remain unnamed had done so. According to that Guardian's will, Sinya would deliver the mission on their behalf. Hyukshin laughed, saying it was just a private trip, really. But since they received a mission, they had no choice but to use it now. The others didn't understand why the protagonist kept calling it a trip when he himself said it wasn't. In any case, Hyukshin understood that they should complete the portal before returning to Korea. It was almost dinner time, so he asked the others if they wanted something to eat. Sunwa said she wanted to try jakkatsu, and he agreed. They could eat at a restaurant. At that, Sinya silently observed Hyukshin as the group walked away. At a glance, it looked like he was putting his safety first. But he always used everything at his disposal to make the biggest profit possible. It was hard to believe, but he was taking advantage of the Guardians. The protagonist thanked the Guardians who had made such amazing offers. He understood that the level of interest they showed him was more than he ever deserved. Even knowing that of all the offers he received, he didn't plan to accept any of them. Hyukshin dared to not accept even one of their missions, nor any of theirs at all. The only thing he could do that day was to accept the intent to receive help. All he could promise was to do his best and deliver the kind of gameplay they wanted to see. In light of that, Sinya reflected on what he had gained in exchange for those references. 3,000 coins from the deal with her and good impression among the Guardians. The outcome even extended to a competition to sponsor that day's mission. If all of this had been his intention from the start, she wondered if he truly understood the kind of danger he was toying with. Meanwhile, the group found a restaurant and stepped inside to take a look. Suddenly, Hyukshin heard a noise and saw many people running in panic. That's when they finally found the portal they had come looking for. They had successfully discovered the Turtle Nest portal. Yun asked if they should go in, and Hyukshin said that Sunwo would take the lead. She agreed, and the protagonist noticed the others were tense. They probably weren't used to letting a child take the lead in situations like this. Despite her appearance, she was the strongest among them all. They would have to get used to Sunwo doing very dangerous things from now on. Soon, they all entered the turtle dungeon, and Hyukshin noticed it was very dark. The area was shaped like a vast swamp, and there was a lot of mud inside. As expected from a portal where no one had any information at all, especially because the environment was unusual and hadn't been cleared by anyone yet. For now, you have to scout the terrain just to be absolutely sure. That's when they looked to the side and found another fairy standing next to them. She didn't know who they were, but started to feel something in her stomach as she looked more closely. In fact, those humans all seemed interesting. A sensation Hyukshin felt was the same as when he looked at Sinya. That strange feeling of being able to see them with his eyes, but not truly perceive them. The eye of perception couldn't sense creatures of a higher level than its user. In other words, she was a being that he couldn't use his powers to see. An intermediate administrator, the fairy Selene, had appeared in front of them. Selene approached to speak with the protagonist because she was sensing something from him. It seemed there was something special about him, and she wanted to take a closer look. He looked a bit older than he appeared. She got the vibe of a veteran from him. Now she could see he actually came from the Korean server and had a hunch he picked the wrong one. In the past, Selene had ranked him on the top 3 in the Japanese server. She had the nickname Rising Star Digger, which made the protagonist reflect on that. If Selene was there, it meant there were players she was broadcasting from somewhere inside the portal. She wasn't certain what it was about Hyukshin, but they might meet again in the future. The fairy left, and the protagonist wondered what exactly was going on. He couldn't say for sure whether there was a player there who had awakened after the tutorial, but there were other things he was certain of. And one of those was that the turtle nest really was the portal that had broken. If there were players inside, they had failed to clear the portal and would perish within. Hyukshin told them to buy the portal map from the item shop, which made Shin curious. He explained that it was an item that showed the real-time locations of team members inside the portal. Still, 1,000 coins was a lot, and she was worried about that. But Hyukshin assured her that paying 1,000 coins was better than paying with their lives. She sighed because she had been saving those 1,000 coins, but Yuyan trusted his words. The activation phrase was portal map, and the usage instructions should be included. If the group was in danger, needed help, or wanted to say something, they could use the map to send a signal. If they weren't in danger but needed to send an alert, they should use yellow. If it was something really dangerous, they would use red to communicate. Hyukjin warned everyone to keep an eye on the map at all times during the portal, and to be careful not to make too much noise as it could attract an unexpected attack. Shin agreed, saying it wasn't even that big of an explanation, and so he decided to move forward with a plan. They would split into pairs and search for any kind of clues inside. Yuyan would go with Shin, and Hyukjin would go with Sunwoo to walk the other direction. If anything happened, they could notify each other through the portal map and regroup. Most important of all is to always pay attention to their positions. It was common for those swamps to have some dangerous marshes. Then Shin laughed, patting Yuyan on the arm and calling him muscular. He complained that she didn't even start by calling him by name. She kept teasing that he could push himself further along with those incredible muscles. Meanwhile, the administrator broadcasting the feed was caught off guard, because several guardians left and suddenly stopped watching his stream. He didn't understand anything. His channel featured Yuyan the finisher. On top of that, they even brought Shin, the person who caught the interest of the true master of the celestial demonic mountain. When you looked, all the guardians had switched to the broadcast being run by Senya. He completely lost the content competition and couldn't figure out how many were now watching that human, a guy progressing through unknown means and knowledge. But he could still make use of another kind of resource to win that competition. The fact that no one knew anything about him because of his exclusive contract. And the administrator spoke to high-ranking guardians because it was truly strange. He was obviously talking about the player Hyukjin and about Senya. Even before that, there was the fact that he knew other things within the Korean server. And all of that before anyone else. Now he was explaining how to use the portal map. It really was curious, and they should want to know the big truth behind all of it. They should want to know whether they were using illegal means. Shin warned them to watch where they were stepping, and Yuyan agreed but reminded them to be careful, because Hyukjin had also warned them to avoid talking so much. They just had to stay quiet. Then they saw what looked like monster shell fragments. It was a level 11 golden turtle, and Shin asked if they should kill it. But Yuyan refused. They would send a yellow signal to let Hyukjin know first. However, the turtle suddenly hid, surprising both of them. Then Shin pointed at something else she saw. It was a man carrying a huge sack. They wondered if that guy was also a player or something. The two approached him and asked if he was Japanese and if he was a player. Maybe he was out hunting. The man denied it. He was actually carrying a monster, a turtle with incredibly high defense. Shin asked if it was true he had managed to communicate or not, and Yuyan said that apparently the player had caught them but couldn't kill them. That was because their defense was too high. He figured that's why the man was collecting them. He'd assumed the man would drag the golden turtles to the water and deal with them there. Shin was surprised that he had figured all that out with so few words. Even so, she asked what they should do now. Maybe they could send the signal to Hyukjin, but he said they didn't know what the key was, so they'd hold off for now. Suddenly, there was a disturbance in the water, and the Japanese man let out a huge scream. When they looked, the man was shouting for help. There was a monster behind him. The two saw something strange happening in the swamp. The man kept yelling that he didn't want to die while being dragged into the water. Shin couldn't understand what was happening. He had monstrous strength. He grabbed her leg while begging for help, and then she finally saw it. A huge monster was emerging from the water. Even Yuyan was surprised. Suddenly, the swamp had expanded, and they didn't even know what to do now. If the player kept clinging to Shin, she would be dragged into the water too. But she didn't want to abandon him either, when suddenly Hyukjin appeared. He simply snapped the man's arm and told her to pull herself together immediately. That was a monster known as the swamp alligator. A monster around level 17, its stats weren't particularly strong, but in a swamp, its strength matched that of a level 25 monster. Trying to kill one in the swamp was far too difficult. Because the swamp functioned as a shield for the alligator, it was impossible to hunt without high penetration attacks. Hyukjin told Sunhwa he'd go ahead and she could follow at her own pace, that he used his light step to reach where his friends were. Unfortunately, Shin was still being grabbed while they were in the swamp. For some reason, the future Sword Empress hesitated to free herself from that hand. The nameless observer just kept watching, and the whispering demon was pleased. The true master of the celestial demonic mountain applauded, and the Lady of the Scales simply remained silent. That's when Hyukjin arrived and asked if she planned to just stand there forever. If he had pulled her, she would have been done for, no doubt. Even so, Shin hesitated because her mind had gone completely blank. She wasn't scared. She didn't know what to do in that moment of panic. If Hyukjin hadn't taken the man's hand away, she probably would have gotten hurt too. He said there was no need to worry, but she should be more careful, because next time she might not be so lucky to have someone there to save her. You even asked what Hyukjin planned to do now about the alligator monster. The protagonist replied that it had just eaten. It would get sleepy and return to land. Sunhwa asked if that monster would really just take a nap, and Hyukjin answered that he had seen something like that in a premonitory dream. For now, they could just sit and watch his behavior. Solan observed this and wondered if it was really possible to have dreams like that. Even if Hyukjin had a prophetic dream, it was like he hadn't predicted the player's death. Even incomplete, that level of foresight was already more than enough. If someone had to sign an exclusive contract at the beginner stage, it better be with someone like him. Then they saw the alligator finally emerge from the water and move on to land. Yuyan was ready to beat it down, and Hyukjin noticed he could channel mana into his fists. The King of Fists truly lived up to the name. Normally, you only saw that after the early stage. But Shin refused because she wanted to be the one to kill it herself. She was in a state of rage, and Hyukjin realized she had leveled up again. Furious and filled with murderous intent, she lost a good part of her humanity after what happened. He said there was no need to do that. Usually, the weak point of monsters was the head. So she charged at the monster with her sword, striking it in the head. Becoming one with the sword was what she did, defeating the monster. To think she had reached that level even without using Light Step, Shin might end up growing even faster than the Shin he had known. That's when she saw she had acquired the quest item, the alligator claw. The claw of a swamp alligator could be shown to an administrator to receive a quest. Senya said that a quest was issued for the player who presented the item. In other words, for Hyukjin, Shin had offered the item to the protagonist after obtaining it. There was no way she could know what would be gained by completing it. It was a quest to kill 5 of those alligators. They had to take down 4 more. Some didn't think they'd manage considering the environment. Fighting in the swamp was asking to die. They had to lure the alligators onto land to kill them like before. The nameless observer and 4 other guardians were eager to watch. That animal had come out of the water just to try to eat a nearby player. In that case, Hyukjin bought a long spear so he could attack from a distance. Then he noticed that Shin was scared for some reason. She seemed to think he would use her as one of the sacrifices to lure the monsters or something like that. He placed a piece of lean black yak meat on the tip of the spear. The meat was very juicy, an ingredient that could make whoever ate it feel satisfied. It was an item he had gotten from the Seoul dungeon where he met Juwon. He thought it would come in handy someday, but Hyukjin didn't expect it to be now. Now he just had to find another one in the swamp, and they understood they used the bait to attract the alligators. It would be a kind of alligator fishing. Shin wasn't sure if it would work. Hyukjin replied that if the alligator went after the meat and ate it, then yes. But everyone had to stay alert. They never knew when one would emerge, especially if it grabbed their ankles. If bitten, they'd have to cut off the foot immediately. It didn't take more than a few seconds for the alligator to eat the meat. The special trait of the black yak was that its meat was very good and juicy. Even eating a small amount would bring great satisfaction. Even just a few bites would leave it fuller than eating an entire person. A swamp alligator had the habit of heading to the shore to rest when full, and once it did that, the strength it had in the swamp would vanish instantly. It would go back to being just a regular level 18 monster. For now, they could attack since it was distracted while eating. Taking down the alligator out of water was easy, and the group joined together to defeat it. Even for someone like Hyukjin, who knew a bit of the future, he had knowledge of the turtle nest. What he knew was that it was a gate that broke due to careless clearing, but for a portal without a well-defined strategy, they had managed to complete it with ease. So Hyukjin informed Senya that they had collected all the alligator claws. Her response made the protagonist wonder if something was wrong, but she denied it, simply completing the quests and offering the rewards. He received a map of the turtle nest with its key features. A map at this point meant the portal had been properly cleared. It showed practically everything important to know about the portal. Just as Hyukjin thought, this was a reverse quest compared to the original. They were supposed to complete the mission to hunt the crocodiles before completing the turtle nest quest. They finally found the true turtle nest, and Hyukjin pointed it out. Now that they were walking inside it, Shin was confused. After all, they didn't see any turtles even though they were in their nest. The protagonist replied that it was probably because of the Japanese player who had found the place first. That's why he had been carrying several golden turtles in a bag. He was probably carrying them because he had failed to hunt them, especially since they hid inside their shells. They searched every corner. There was no transparent crystal there. There were 3 nests in total. They check all of them as indicated by the map. The group moved toward the first entrance in the portal, and Hyukjin spoke with Shin and Yuhyun. They had to make sure the turtles didn't escape back into the water. They wouldn't be able to catch them if they went back to the water, and they agreed with the orders. Each golden turtle could offer a good amount of coins, and if they were lucky, they might even drop random coin boxes. The most famous strategy associated with golden turtles was the secret mission, Collective Spirit of the Golden Turtle. It didn't take long for Shin to finish clearing 2 nests and gather a ton of them. Even so, she didn't understand why they didn't just kill them all at once. And Hyukjin replied that it was because mass hunting was much more efficient. Soon they completed the hidden mission of the Collective Spirit of the Golden Turtles. For 30 minutes, the drop rate for random coin boxes increased by 10%, and coin earnings would also rise by the same percentage. Even though it was a hidden mission, it was actually a strategy everyone knew in the future. The condition to activate it was to gather at least 40 golden turtles at once. There were even golden turtle farms and slaughterhouses built around this tactic. Hyukjin was the first to discover the hidden mission in question. There was a title that could be linked to this first discovery of a hidden mission. The title was called First Pioneer, and it could connect to the mission. He chose to first view the detailed option, explaining what the connection was for. If a player with the First Pioneer title was the first to discover a hidden mission, they could trigger a linked scenario. Linked scenarios could be triggered up to 3 times in total. If he did that, it would unlock the hidden boss spawn scenario, the Venomous Golden Turtle. A venomous golden turtle, an intermediate monster around level 30. If Hyukjin received a boss monster boost on top of that, it would be as strong as a level 35 monster. It wasn't exactly a monster you could hunt unless you had a player with high poison resistance. The protagonist still had his mandrake gloves, which were resistant to poison, but he couldn't take the risk, so he decided to pass up the opportunity. Shin didn't understand what he was doing, and he asked her to wait a moment. She also received a notification about a drop rate increase and coin gain. She was quite satisfied with the experience she got there. She wouldn't be greedy. If the others wanted, they could just split the tasks among themselves. She had learned a lot that day and owed them another debt. Then she smiled and suggested they could count this as a date, although Hyukjin had no idea at what point it could be seen that way. Yuyeon said he was there to help and didn't want any rewards for it. Samwa agreed that she'd just do whatever Hyukjin told her. She had no objections. After a moment, he asked if anyone had a large blunt weapon for smashing. Yuyeon said he had a big hammer and decided to lend it to the protagonist who asked. As expected, the hammer was really heavy. Hitting a moving target with it was impossible. But if the target was a stationary rock like now, it shouldn't be too hard. Hyukjin said they were about to start earning coins. He'd begin with 70,000. Whatever was left over, he split evenly among all of them. Samwig didn't understand anything but thanked him anyway. The protagonist never intended to monopolize the reward on his own. They also needed to receive some rewards to stay motivated. He figured he'd be working with that team for a while, so this was the least he could do. Then he swung the hammer to see how much he could earn. Striking the golden turtle and taking its life, Hyukjin earned 200 coins. The more he kept doing it, the more and more coins he collected. The others didn't know what he was doing. He seemed like someone specialized in wielding heavy weapons from their perspective. But soon the protagonist also obtained a random coin box. Getting 7 of them and opening them would trigger another hidden mission he was interested in. It was exhausting, but he really needed to get 7 of them from those turtles. Hyukjin continued smashing the golden turtles, hoping he could get them all. Even so, Shin didn't understand how he could be faster than her. Yuya noticed that his strength stat was even higher than his own. It seemed like Hyukjin was stronger and faster than both of them. It was a bit shocking to see. Even though he was a higher level than the two of them, it was still a bit much given the situation. He kept acquiring more and more random boxes as he brought down each turtle. Finally, Hyukjin got the 7th one, earning around 20,000 coins. That left him with 50,000 before reaching his goal of 70,000. The protagonist began opening the first random box and obtained another 6,000 coins. In the second one, he got another 1,400 coins. That brought the total to 7,800 coins at the end. He hadn't expected so many to come out of just a single box. But to his misfortune, the next box only had 70 coins, which made him sigh. Only 4 coin boxes remained, and he mentally begged to get more. Then he acquired another 9,000 coins, 700 more, and also 2,000. With that, he finished opening all 7 random boxes successfully and completed the hidden part of the jackpot challenge. Hyukjin celebrated in his mind because he achieved the same result as in the past. He was also the first to meet the conditions for the jackpot challenge. He could link the title of First Pioneer with the jackpot challenge and trigger a new link scenario. If a player was the first to earn the First Pioneer title and uncover the hidden quest, it would activate the link scenario. The scenario would turn the random coin box into a double coin box. Hyukjin asked Sinyip to share the reward he received, catching the attention of the Guardians. The nameless observer grew curious, as did the Whispering Devil. The true master of the celestial demonic mountain was impatient, and the brave Lion King beat his chest. Naturally, his action made everyone uncomfortable. Even so, Hyukjin would transform the 7th box into a double coin box. It was a box that doubled the number of coins when opened, so he could gain more money if he opened it while holding a large amount of coins. But coins gained through trading wouldn't count. This was a place they had all worked hard together to clear. They were all members of a team that had fought side by side. That's why Hyukjin thought of buying the box and giving at least 3,000 coins to each of them. That was a fair way to distribute the rewards, which made Yubi unemotional. But Shin felt uneasy and anxious. Hyukjin couldn't blame her for that. 3,000 coins was an enormous amount for a beginner. Senya told the protagonist that connecting the first opponent title to a secret mission could only be done 3 times. But the protagonist replied that it was fair to share things, even if it cost him one of those chances. In truth, that wasn't exactly the reason. Hyukjin just wanted the 70,000 coins immediately. The Lady of the Scales was impressed, but the Whispering Devil hated him. He was simply taking advantage of the opportunity to earn the Lady of the Scales' favor, just to get her to side with him as his guardian. At just the right moment, with the coin doubling effect, Hyukjin decided to link the first opponent with the hidden jackpot challenge. And so he successfully changed the coin box into a double coin box. At the moment, he had 43,219 coins. In total, he now held 86,438 coins. He would give 3,000 to each of them, thanking them for their support in the portal. Yuyan still believed that Hyukjin had done everything on his own, which made the protagonist think that was a cute reaction and had surpassed his long-term goal. The Lady of the Scales sent a sponsorship of 500 coins to the protagonist. Hyukjin thought she was stingy for someone so famous, but it was better than nothing. Even so, he asked Yuyan to go ahead and destroy the transparent crystal. That way, they liberated the turtle nest and its portal, distributing the rewards. All of them received 500 coins in total and a return scroll to the beginner's tower. Shin didn't know what that scroll was, but Hyuchin told everyone to use it. That thing appearing while they were in the Japanese portal had good timing. The police would probably stop them if they exited the normal way. At that moment, Sini approached to offer the compensation for the turtle nest. He realized it was a quest from a guardian who refused to give their name. He received 7,000 coins, and the two of them stared at each other silently. For going through a mere beginner portal like that, he had earned an enormous amount. A guardian had intervened directly through Sinya, who still tried to remain hidden. If it had been the Lady of the Scales, she would have issued the quest herself, so it wasn't her. The Shepherd of Las Vegas didn't seem likely either, since he was in the US server. Hyuchin didn't know who sent it. There was no way to find out now. Either way, he decided they should return now and use the return scroll. At that, Sinya decided to stream again from the Korean server, the Beginner's Tower. When they used the scroll, they returned to Korea, which left them confused. After all, they couldn't even see the rest of the people who were supposed to be there. The people there weren't real, but just characters, NPCs. They were like bots that only existed in specific places, like the Beginner's Tower. Shin noticed that this must have been Tower D. She never expected it to change so much. Yuyan wondered if it was really okay in terms of legal entry, and Hyuchin replies that they could do whatever they want, thanking them for their efforts. Then he remembers that Yuyan and Shin would clear the Seoul Station dungeon 25 times as quickly as possible. The two are confused by what they hear, and the protagonist agrees. He knew they could do even more than that, but they should stay at that pace. That was one of the conditions of being an early riser, after all. Shin agrees because they understood the strategy, so it would be quite easy. Yuyan also agrees, saying they'd wrap it up in a blink. Sunway asks what she should do since she was a tanker. He asks her to go home because he would arrive later than that. Still, Hyuchin noticed she had a bit of a brother complex, which was weird. Even so, he asked her to go home because he would bring ice cream when he returned. That convinced her enough for them to make it back in time. And so he let her go while Hyuchin wondered if she loved ice cream that much. At that moment, he saw the escalator that led to floor 200, the beginner tower floor. 15 people could teleport at the same time, but there was no one there now. 100 coins were needed, and the protagonist decided he would go anyway. As he climbed the staircase, the protagonist knew that Sinya thought he was wasting his money. And she agrees, since spending money to go up wouldn't achieve anything. There was nothing up there. He himself knew that there was nothing on the second floor at the moment. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that it was open for Hyuchin to see. Originally, the second floor of the beginner tower wasn't something that opened automatically, which meant it had been opened by someone again, also by the Demon King, a player whose identity remained a mystery until 10 years ago. The leader of the Demon King's army, known as the Nightmare. He was always behind the scenes in every historic disaster after the Cataclysm. If there was one thing known about his actions, it's that he was the first to walk up to the second floor of the beginner tower and receive the bonus from it. It didn't matter that he was the first. The other bonus was given to the first few people. The Demon King could be up there now. It was likely he was the one who opened the second floor this time as well. Suddenly, a powerful presence was detected on that floor. The eye of perception was temporarily deactivated, making Hyuchin feel like his eyes had been crushed. But even so, he thought he saw someone, or rather, he was sure. He was so paralyzed he could barely open his eyes to see clearly. That made him wonder if it really was the Demon King who had appeared. Still, the eye of perception was forcibly reactivated. When that happened, he realized that the figure from before had disappeared. That was for the best. He had no intention of fighting the Demon King. He could accomplish his goals just fine without doing that. So Hyuchin tells Sinya to open the secret item shop now, catching her by surprise. And she agrees that the shop in question does exist, but using it requires 50,000 coins. But obviously, the protagonist had enough money and opened it anyway. This wasn't a method an ordinary beginner could use. The hidden item shop could only be accessed for 60 seconds. All the items in the hidden shop were limited to one per stock. It wasn't impossible for beginners to have 50,000 coins, but no one would spend that much just to browse the shop for 60 seconds. Then he received an open bonus, and the bargain seller perk kicked in. Several offers were unlocked, and Hyuchin had saved 70,000 coins specifically for this. All by the high-level assistant scroll that was enchanted and helped with progression. There was a high chance it could raise the class grade to help the player advance. Now Sinya could understand why he had gathered 70,000 coins with the discount in mind. This seemed to be yet another one of his plays based on his precognitive dream. But beyond that, just looking was enough to see how strange this all was. That player was very suspicious. Even if he had precognitive dreams, it was unacceptable. The administrator arrived saying he believed there was a high chance this was a bug. A request was then received to investigate the issue through Neptune. Neptune tells Hyuchin to come closer so they could begin. Instead, the protagonist tells Neptune to come over, since he was the one who wanted to scan. Right away, Hyuchin provokes him by calling him a pygmy, irritating the administrator. He used the power of forced submission to make the protagonist obey his will. If he kept talking like that, he would definitely end up dead. A mere human dared to provoke a mid-tier administrator. He should know his place. Maybe it was because he had Sinya, who was naive, that he acted with such courage. And he even provoked, saying to try again if he really could do it. Hyukjin realizes he should prepare himself since there must be several ways to deal with it, and he stands up, warning that he couldn't be killed even with Neptune finding him bold. The protagonist knew the administrator thought he would do whatever he was ordered to, but he was just playing dirty because Neptune had done it first. And he only resisted because Neptune had made threats first, without any proof. He only called him a pygmy because after all, that was the name of his race. Still, he didn't understand what he did to be treated so rudely. Neptune tells him to shut up because he was acting innocent, even though he wasn't. All he could do was wait and see what punishment would be given to him. For a guy like him who had crossed the line, it was clear he needed a lesson. That's when the Lady of the Scales sympathized with Hyukjin's words and came to his defense. She applied the special power of innocent until proven guilty. Because of that, the power of forced submission on Hyukjin was removed. Neptune was caught off guard, but the protagonist smiled because the Guardians supported him. The pressure that had been crushing his body vanished and Hyukjin managed to stand up. The true master of the Celestial Demon Mountain hated cowards, so he would apply a special power called eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Neptune was shocked and begged them to wait, but they ignored him. No matter how many viewers he lost to Sinia, he still managed to surpass her. He was weak when people called him a pygmy, and he'd stay that way for another 10 years. To an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, all of the player's abilities were drastically increased temporarily. He activated his eye of perception as he received a strength buff against his opponent. Now Hyukjin could read Neptune's information, including how competitive he was. Unfortunately, he didn't have high enough proficiency, so some details were cut off. Even facing a mid-level administrator who thought he was amazing, now the protagonist was sure he wouldn't lose in a one-on-one fight. But doing that on a stream just because he got stronger wouldn't be a good move. It wasn't the kind of thing either Hyukjin or the Guardians would want to see. To begin with, there was no need to do any of that, and he hoped the system check would end. A solid complaint would be enough to bring Neptune down instead. The result of Neptune's evaluation found no bugs in Hyukjin. He couldn't understand what had happened because so little had shown up, and Hyukjin dares him to accuse him again. He probably wouldn't be able to do it. But since he accused him without evidence, it was just because he was weaker. Above all, that kind of cowardly behavior was exactly what could be seen in Neptune, and he tells him to apologize immediately, which makes him angry. He quickly apologizes, embarrassed that he was forced into something like that. Hyukjin doesn't even know what he was talking about. After all, it should be something like an apology. Meanwhile, the protagonist's sister was tense as she heard their mother speak. Even though Hyukjin had eaten, she heard it clearly and was irritated. Even though she had taken the time to make dinner, he ate out and that annoyed her. Then the mother got curious as to why the sister suddenly made a stew. And the mother laughs when she gives a more defensive response, saying she cooked because she thought the kitchen looked nice. She would believe the excuse, but at least she could put less salt in the food next time. Meanwhile, the sister wonders what exactly Hyukjin was doing. In his room, the protagonist sees that he received a non-aggression pact from Neptune. He couldn't attack after closing the channel, and there was also a ring from that so-called pygmy. The pygmy's ring was made by a dwarf blacksmith, which was quite rare. He had two things he could do now, and he needed to think more about it. The real player community was developing into a different kind of forum. That day, it served as a gathering place and a space for player exchanges. It would be great if Hyukjin could find what he had been looking for so much. When he entered the site, he saw that they were recruiting a tank to join a team. They were looking for a player to challenge the short table dungeon. The nickname was pretty embarrassing, but that person would receive nothing but great things 10 years from now. That was Lord Flame, Choi Sungu, and taking that into account, the dungeon was in the post. That would be the short table dungeon, his first dungeon. Different from other dungeons like the Seoul Station, this one had a special highlight. It was possible to earn rewards by clearing it multiple times in a row. The short table dungeon was a dungeon that appeared when there was an event and disappeared once completed. Even now, there were players losing their lives while challenging dungeons every day. Including the Seoul Station dungeon, there weren't many posts setting up raids or people responding. This was Hyukjin's chance, and he decided to join a group as a level 25 tank. To earn more money in less time, he needed to go to a dungeon that would bring profit, even if that meant putting himself at risk because of the decision. Dungeons weren't places that killed players by nature, but rather opportunities to find all sorts of treasures. At Konkuk University Station, he would bring only one person. Though at first it seemed like a problem, it actually looked like it made him happy. The more people there were, the fewer rewards each person would receive upon completion. He wanted to go in with as few people as possible. Getting the smallest possible group for a dungeon like that was madness. After all, it was a dungeon that hadn't even been cleared before. That's when Sunwoo met the guy with the nickname Jaeindong Fire Master. Hyukjin was accompanying Sunwoo, meeting the guy for the first time. He actually looked like a skeleton now and was just a normal guy 10 years ago. 10 years from now, he looked like a soccer ball from how fat he'd become. The protagonist says he was the one who wanted to join the group, and the guy bows in greeting. That's when Hyukjin's eye of perception was activated on the guy. He could see this was the player named Choi Sungu. Choi didn't understand why there was hesitation, but the protagonist was occupied. The Sunset Giant invoked his innate power. He couldn't examine Choi now. The protagonist was caught off guard because a guardian was interfering. Sunwoo asks if everything's okay, and Hyukjin agrees, changing the subject. He had thought that Choi hadn't chosen a guardian yet since he hadn't reached level 30. Even if he had, a guardian normally wouldn't get involved. But it was far more than it seemed. Choi was surprised when he looked at Sunghwa. That girl was part of his team and she agreed because she was with Kyukjin. Choi was worried about her because it seemed way too dangerous. He asked her to wait a bit, since Sunghwa was still just a child. Still, she snapped back saying she wasn't a child, but for Choi, it made no difference. But Kyukjin always knew he was weak when it came to kids. It was different from Ju-won. Choi wouldn't accept this no matter what. He just shouted at her to listen and leave once and for all. Sunghwa refused because she only listened to Kyukjin and no one else. Even so, Choi thought it was insane because this wasn't just any dungeon. Whatever they were going to face at the second portal wasn't a joke in any way. While he was trying to explain, Hyukjin wondered if that monster had shown up. That being was the fire horse, a beast-level monster around level 32. It was a spirit-type monster, much like the six-tailed fox. However, it was a horse with a flaming mane and tail, and everywhere it stepped, it left a trail of fire. Choi sighed at the stubbornness. It was a relief though, because he lost interest if he thought someone was weak. If not for something like this, he would have walked away a long time ago. So if someone could endure its attacks for him, he'd strike from behind. Kyukjin was glad at least he was modest with his words. It seemed like he truly believed he could win in this state. And Choi agreed because he managed to reduce the monster's HP by half on his own. That was why Hyukjin could see the reason he made it out alive. If he had less than a 20% chance, he wouldn't have been able to escape. Fire horses naturally went easy on the weak and didn't chase them afterward. That's why the dungeon was designed so players could enter and leave freely. The fire horse was too strong, so entry was allowed at any time. All of it was to lower the dungeon's difficulty and support players. Hyukjin understood that Choi hadn't gotten too close to the portal, and he agreed because the horse was too powerful to face alone. He thought there wouldn't be anyone strong enough near the portal, but Kyukjin still thought someone might be, so they could go check anyway. Choi guided the two into the area, saying there were some guys in black with cow masks around earlier, but he had taken care of them himself, and Hyukjin figured they were black yaks. As he thought, the monsters didn't respawn because the dungeon was a one-time instance. They head toward a dead-end path, and if they enter the portal, the horse would appear. And the place whose name Choi didn't know would change into some kind of field. He sighs in disbelief that they brought a kid into the middle of the mess. He was just speaking out of caution, but Choi tells Sunghwa she can run away if she needs to. As long as she gives him a heads up, he wouldn't mind since he'd be right behind her. Sunghwa agrees, but Hyukjin could see the girl was actually getting really irritated. Finally, the group enters the field of the fire horse inside the dungeon. Choi points at the level 35 fire horse that appeared. The proficiency of the Eye of Perception was too low to provide a detailed explanation. For now, the protagonist walks ahead since they would launch the first attack, and he guides Sunghwa to approach, while Choi should also get ready. Hyukjin tells Choi to attack from the side, with the goal of reducing its HP to at least 40%. If he had a buff that increased critical hit chance, he should use it immediately. It caught Choi off guard because he never said he had anything like that. But Hyukjin ignores him and says the horse is being cautious now so they could go in. He guides Sunghwa to go after it, just being careful with its kicks. The two rush at the monster, which prepares to confront them. They keep taking on the fire horse's attacks and defending themselves. Choi observed this and realized he didn't actually need to worry about them. The duo's combat coordination was perfect, and they had the right capability. So he uses his fatal flames to throw himself into the fight as well. The attack works and lands a 3% critical strike. The fire horse was a strong monster early on, but it was still a beast type. All beast type monsters have vulnerable spots on their bodies. That includes the spine, neck, heart, and forehead. Now there was a dagger stuck in one of those spots, giving a chance for a critical hit. Choi's Fatal Flames was a skill that increased critical rate with every strike. His attacks were boosting their percentage more and more. Even though it was a fire horse, there was no escaping his skill. It was difficult. The horse kept getting hit non-stop by every one of his attacks. The fire horse started preparing a ritual right away. The areas where it had stepped were beginning to burn again. It was the perfect time, and Hyukjin tells them to pull that thing out of their inventories. He was using a special skill called Instant Step. That's how the protagonist lunged at the opponent again and struck it. Choi was shocked by what appeared before his eyes. He had simply decided to use a fire extinguisher to defeat the fire monster. When the fire horse's HP dropped to 20%, the traits of a monster began to emerge. This was a ritual to summon its master, so they had to extinguish the flames completely to stop it. Hyukjin shouts to Choi, telling him to attack with everything he's got and finish it. Even Choi was surprised because he ended up being left out of the fun, but he finally uses his fatal flames again to attack the horse. The critical strike lands at last after reaching 36%. After a few more hits, the two managed to defeat it and gain experience. Hyukjin compliments him for arriving just in time to save the day, but Choi laughs and tells him to shut up because they were both damn bastards for hiding that item the whole time. But hey, he was good enough himself to use a fire extinguisher. Anyway, that was the only prize he ever got as a kid. Hyukjin feels that even with Choi saying that, he was still pretty happy to have killed the horse. Sunghwa approaches, saying the horse left an item behind. When they looked, it was a flame essence that had been dropped. There was an awakening material that enhances the magical power of the fire attribute. When consumed by a player with affinity, all fire-based skills are drastically boosted. Hyuk-jin wonders why the horse left that behind, and even Choi was surprised, especially because they just handed him the item like it was nothing. The protagonist told him to check the item's details, and he'd understand, especially since the condition to consume it was having the blessing of the Sunset Giant. As expected, the description for Choi was different from the one Hyuk-jin had read. He had never heard of that giant. It meant the Guardian had chosen Choi and given him that. Even so, Choi thought it was strange because he wouldn't have been able to kill the monster of that Hyuk-jin. And since it was him who did most of the work, receiving a reward felt like too much. The protagonist tells him not to stress over something like that, but he felt bad about it. They could negotiate another way to calm things down. They would get priority on the next rewards to make up for it. It didn't mean they would take everything, but they could discuss it. Choi agrees since that would make him feel a little less neglected. With that, Hyuk-jin got an ironclad justification and smiled. When Choi drank the item, the dungeon's identity became clear as day. The dungeon was a training ground created by the Sunset Giant himself to awaken Choi. They must have spent a lot of money to make this work. But since Choi said he yielded to them, the Whispering Devil enjoyed the joke. Now he wonders what kind of item might be hidden on the other side. Passing through the second portal of the short table dungeon, they head toward the third. And so they arrive at the Ravine of Fire and had to meet the conditions to enter. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to leave the Ravine of Fire. They had to cross the Ravine of Fire. On the other side was a land of fortunes and riches. It was likely that the one called Kunten was on the other side, and they had to go through. Choi felt like he was going to melt to death and asked how they could possibly cross. The protagonist realized that the Sunset Giant only wanted Choi to survive. The fire flowed like a river and was about 7 meters wide to the other side. It was way too hot. If they crossed, they'd end up getting fried along the way. It was obvious that anyone other than Choi, who had used the flame essence, couldn't pass. And Hyuk-jin asks Choi if he could make it through. He replies that he thought he could. That's because the other two probably wouldn't be able to. It was better for Choi to go first. Even so, Choi questions what this was all of a sudden, saying everyone should go together. He didn't want to leave the two behind after the argument they just had. Even so, Hyuk-jin sighs because that would be the same as asking them to die. So the video ends here. If you don't want to miss the next part, activate the notification bell, and see you next time on Tob's channel.